All right, welcome comrades. Welcome to Marxists Speak Out, 200 Days of War. Stop the war of US NATO imperialism against Russia. Stop the US preparations of war against China. My name is Davey Heller, and I'm going to be, I'm from a website called Class Conscious, and I'm based in Australia, and I'm going to be facilitating today's meeting. So let's make a start. In the spirit of Marxist internationalism, it is exciting to be able to bring together speakers from 10 countries and 5 continents to share their perspectives on what is both a decisive moment in the class struggle and human history. It is only through building links internationally and sharing our perspectives can we clarify our ideas to enable us to play the necessary leadership role as the working class moves towards overthrowing capitalism. Today's panel builds on 2 previous panels that have been held since Russia launched its military intervention in Ukraine. The first was held 1 month into the conflict and perhaps at the height of the pro-imperialist war hysteria, entitled Marxists Speak Out on the conflict between Russia and imperialism. A second panel was held in August entitled Marxists Speak Out, Victory Day Against Nazism and Imperialism, Yesterday and Today. A May Day declaration against the imperialist war on Russia was also issued and signed by many of the groups involved today. This is the first initiative, though, organised under the banner of World on Fire, worldwide organising network against fascism, imperialism and exploitation. It is hoped this becomes an ongoing network to organise internationally against imperialist war and fascism. Today's panel is being streamed live to a call for action, Stop US-led imperialism's war against Russia and China's Facebook page, and we posted to the World on Fire YouTube page after the event. We also plan to publish online as many transcripts of the speeches as possible after the event. Each speaker today will be speaking for a maximum of 10 minutes. All right, we'll make a start with our speakers. We're going to start first with our European comrades, as it's already quite late on Saturday night in Europe. So the first speaker for today is from the Communist Revolutionary Action in Greece. So I'd like to introduce to you Nikos from Communist Revolutionary Action. Thank you.
Hello, comrades. It's so nice to see you again, everybody. I feel very nice being along you because I feel that as more our relationships get deepened, the more the possible perspective for more in-depth relationships and more better situation between us arises. I'm going to start right away with my intervention. As it is I believe this is a very common characteristic in all of us, that we have made very many discussions with friends, colleagues, and other political adversaries, let's say. And I believe that one very common characteristic which arises when we're discussing about these very crucial issues regarding imperialistic hegemony is the issues of, let's say, exceptionalism. I believe that methodologically speaking, our perspective believes that the war in Ukraine should not be seen as a single event. Consciously or not, we are adopting a methodology which says that in order to understand Ukraine, you have to contextualize it in what happened in the last 30 years. In our opinion, I believe this is shared by all of us, the end of the Cold War was a signaling point for the unraveling of a global reactionary strategy of subordinating the whole globe under NATO's boots. And so, in our opinion, we cannot see Ukraine irrelevantly of what happened in Serbia, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Afghanistan, as well as in other countries in which the coup attempts and the orange revolutions were not successful, like in Venezuela, Iran, Palestine. So it's very important in order to understand Ukraine, someone has to place Ukraine in the context of this historical happening. On the other hand, comrades or even political adversaries follow a somehow exceptionalist reasoning. They view Ukraine as a single situation. They view it as an expression of some kind of eternal and inherent authoritarianism of Russia. In this sense, these political adversaries and ex-comrades which have succeeded to the imperialist bloc, in the end of the day, they follow a non-materialistic way of thinking about political problems because they try to pose an explanation which is, in the end of the day, metaphysical. Because if you are trying to explain Ukraine on the basis of some kind of inherent aggressiveness of the neighbor, this is not a lot more strange or far away from attributing in general explanations to somehow an inherent kind of spiritual or constitutional idea. So sometimes if one listens to the more honest persons of our political enemies and the bourgeoisie, somehow this kind of notions put some kind of a light to this kind of exceptionalism, which we also find in broad left-wing camps. Let me pose the example of Jordan Peterson, for example, who is a far-right scumbag influencer, who recently said that Russian aggression is a general characteristic of Russian people from its beginning. And I wonder really, how far different is this kind of, let's say, rough and without sensitivities and interpretation in comparison to what broad left-wing or libertarian or anarchist viewpoints regarding Ukraine. In my opinion, they are actually saying the same kind of idealist and metaphysical explanation. But the issue is that the material circumstances are unfortunately very stubborn situations. And one, in order to understand Ukraine, needs to see how Russia tried to reconcile with Ukraine, how it tried to make the Minsk agreements, how even though the neo-Nazis were killing thousands of people, torturing and making horrible crimes, the Russians continued of saying that there is a peaceful pathway towards solving this problem. And the issue is that all these crimes were actually based on true fascist ideology. This is very, very elaborated, and no one can actually negate that Ukraine, in its very big part, is characterized right now, its institutions and mainly its army, by having the true fascist ideology. So the issue is that the developments also. So one part is what has happened during the last 6 months and before. Another issue is what is happening in the months after the arisal of the special military operation in Ukraine. In fact, new crises are emerging, as the title is saying. For example, how should we understand the arrival of kamikaze Pelosi to Taiwan? How did this happen? How is it possible that while the world is struggling with solving such a big international crisis, all of a sudden, the United States of America, as a representative of NATO, is trying to push another crisis in international politics? And let me pose another question. How is it happening that all of these stars of the so-called national liberations somehow become so aligned with each other during this specific period? It's not a mistake that the so-called Taiwanese independence is in allegiance with the war in Ukraine, with Kurdish liberation struggles, and others, Hong Kong, for example. How is this happening that these specific national liberation movements feel so aligned and in connection to these specific other national liberation struggles? We believe that this is not that this is not by chance. This somehow feeling of allegiance is actually facilitated by the millions and billions of US dollars that is given to these so-called liberation struggles in order to facilitate their armed goals against the rest of the world. And also, how can it be happen that freedom and liberation can supposedly be happening with American F-34s and British drones? Excuse me. No, of course, this is not possible. These are not national liberation movements. These are just imperialist networks funded by all of these NATO frameworks, and these constitutions, these organizations have eroded so much of the governments of the rest of the world to the point that they become true puppets of the NATO lords. Well, now towards going to the last part of my intervention, I want to pose the question: why is this happening? In our opinion, as Communist Revolutionary Action, we believe that that right now we are facing a historical crossroad to the likes of 1940, 1914, etc. What is being posed right now is the doubting of the 500 years of global European dominance. We are now in a crossroad whose beginning started with Cortez's landing in Latin America, was consolidated in the Dutch and English East Indies Company, and the creation of the so-called great empires of Spain, France, England, etc. So the question which is posed now is whether the European law overlords will continue to steal the fruits of global labor, products, and land of the rest of the world. The question which is posed is whether we will live in a unipolar world under the threat of a military intervention by the West in case some government want to have a social program and not sell all of its wealth to them. The question which is posed is whether we will also live under the cultural dominance of the West, their own specific neocolonial ideologies and practices. And let me also state that it is a very basic challenge to true revolutionary thinking to break from all of these academic, news, and ideological institutions which are continuously trying to impose on how we should think, feel, and understand about reality and one another. So, in order to summarize, for us the question is clear. Even though the situation is not as clear as it might have been 70 years ago during the Second World War with the armed struggle of the CCCP, nevertheless, the question should be answered on the basis of our true class interests and hearts, which lie with the non-privileged people of this world, with the global South, with the Asian peoples, which are also trying right now to liberate themselves from the continuous neocolonial domination of the West. We are in allegiance with the people who are fearing that they will become the new Iraqs and the new Afghanistans. We are in the allegiance with the ones who feel that their wealth is being stolen, and it is truly being stolen. Our interests and hearts lie with the global South. Thank you, comrades. This is it.
Thank you very much, Nikos from Communist Revolutionary Action in Greece for that presentation. We'll move straight on to the Consistent Democrats from the LCFI in Great Britain.
Thank you, comrades. I'm speaking for the Consistent Democrats. My name's Ian. The Consistent Democrats are the British section of the LCFI. We see the war in Ukraine as a crucial conflict in this period between imperialism and its opponents and victims. It's a product of the decay of imperialism and in particular the world imperialist hegemon, the United States, whose decline of an imperialist power is well underway, in a manner somewhat analogous to the situation British imperialism began to suffer after World War I. Because if you look back, after the German challenge was defeated in 1918, Britain was eclipsed, not by an enemy, but by what became its most important ally, the United States. And the US is actually originally a creation of mainly British colonists, but it negated and pushed out its originator and became British imperialism's successor as the world hegemon. And this became possible because of the economic decline of British imperialism as an economic and military power. Its internal contradictions in terms of the beginning of its economic decline, and not least it's the developing revolt of many of its colonial subjects against their own subordination. These liberation struggles expanded massively after World War I, and the decline of Britain proceeded apace in the interwar period. And the liberation struggles were massively accelerated by the Russian Revolution in 1917 and the enormous ideological and often material help and inspiration that the initially revolutionary Soviet Republic under the early Bolshevik dictatorship gave to anti-colonial struggles everywhere. Since the British Empire at that point was by far the biggest, it was most shaken and damaged by the Russian Revolution and its galvanizing effect internationally. In parallel with that, we had the Great Depression and the 1929, the tragic course that the class struggle took because of that, with Hitler's rise in Germany, and the viability of British imperialism its hegemony was further massively eroded. Germany under Hitler's rule, jointly with Japan, and to a lesser extent Italy, attempted to take advantage of the decline of Britain and to head off the evident project of the United States to replace Britain as the world hegemon. And in a sense, the United States was helped to victory and the conquest of world hegemony over its imperialist rivals by the successful resistance of the first worker state, albeit degenerated, the USSR, to Hitler. Both the imperialist allies of the United States in World War II, Britain and France, and its imperialist enemies, Germany, Japan, and Italy, became its clients in a military sense. Despite considerable economic tensions and episodic disagreements, sorry, what's happening? Despite considerable economic tensions and episodic disagreements over the last 3/4 of a century since World War II, that pecking order has remained essentially intact, but it's being threatened decisively now by the economic and military decline of the United States as the world hegemon, whose fundamental problem is the most basic problem in the capitalist system itself, the long-term tendency of profit rates to decline. And that's what's driven the United States to a course of action that's put US hegemony in danger. Deindustrialization has become a categorical imperative in all the older capitalist countries and has particularly affected the United States and Britain. The large-scale export of manufacturing jobs to East Asia, and particularly China, has created a new situation in the world. It dovetailed splendidly with the project of counter-revolution from above of the Chinese Stalinists that grew out of Deng Xiaoping's market reforms to a Chinese deformed worker state at the end of the 1970s. And this accumulated through the 1980s as part of China's bloc with US imperialism against the USSR. So the Chinese Stalinist bureaucracy helped imperialism destroy the USSR, and it was the military pressure of imperialism that forced it to devote a disproportionate part of its resources to the military. And this brought about the economic stagnation in the USSR that led a decisive section of the bureaucracy to capitulate to imperialism through the program of perestroika, both in the economic sense with an accelerating drive to embrace the market, in a manner that always logically pointed to capitalist restoration, and in the military sense, in a strategic sense, as escaping from that military pressure, it logically pointed to capitulation. And that's what basically happened. And as a result, Russia underwent capitalist restoration and an incredibly ruinous economic shock treatment at the beginning of the 1990s, after the August 1991 failed coup attempt. And Gorbachev's perestroika, initially sweetened by glasnost, the false promise of political freedom to the working class, it led to millions of deaths. The economic decline under Yeltsin, who expressed Gorbachev's program more consistently, the economic decline was steeper and more deadly than that happened in Germany after 1929. And in Russia, the experience of millions of deaths and impoverishment at the hands of imperialism and neoliberalism led to a massive popular backlash against neoliberalism. And it led to the growth of nostalgia for much better times under the Soviet workers' state, even under Stalinist rule. So the thing is that imperialist capitalism was torn out by the roots in Russia in 1917, and that's a material fact of enormous significance for Marxists. There can be no comparison of Russia with Germany for that reason. So the popular backlash in Russia was a backlash against neoliberalism. The defeated official communist movement was in no position to lead opposition to capitalism and neoliberalism. So what happened instead is that part of the Russian bourgeoisie, which had inherited the military power of the USSR, saw the opportunity to develop in a different direction, using that military power and its economic weight as an energy supplier, particularly, in the first instance. The result being a peculiar form of non-imperialist capitalism, which has negligible power in terms of the financial plundering nature of imperialism, but considerable military power and power as an energy supplier, comparable in some ways to Saudi Arabia or Iraq or Venezuela in that sense. And it had a unique ability to resist imperialist domination. At the same time, the imperialist export of large numbers of jobs and industry, driven by the quest to raise declining profit rates, led to China's growth as an industrial power. And it benefited from what John Smith, the author of a work called Imperialism in the 21st Century, called global labor arbitrage, which basically was about the export of manufacturing jobs to low-wage economies. And China benefited enormously from that in a funny sort of, in a paradoxical way, because this happened concurrently with the counter-revolution from above in China that proceeded apace in the 1990s and took a very, very different form from in Russia. And China's form of capitalist restoration actually avoided neoliberal shock treatments afflicted Russia, and China managed to industrialize itself and become a major industrial power that benefited again in a paradoxical way from its status as a reservoir of cheap but skilled. It benefited out of the imperialist neoliberal drive to outsource industrial labor. And it paradoxically allowed the Chinese bureaucracy to restore capitalism from above with a kind of bourgeois mixed economy that's very, very much marked by China's decades as a deformed worker state. And that also allowed China to paradoxically resist imperialist domination. And this is bizarre. I mean, when they realized what had happened, this produced anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States, expressed in Trumpism, when the penny dropped as to what the US bourgeoisie had managed to do. And they created a non-imperialist capitalist industrial rival whose driving force is not finance capital, i.e. the extraction of revenue in a parasitic sense from dependent countries. These two major non-imperialist countries have been driven together for self-defense against US imperialism, which is very, very fearful of its own future, of its world hegemony. And US imperialism, as we know, it cannot tolerate any country in the world that seriously endeavours to defy it and assert real sovereignty. And that's what this conflict is about. It's about the decline of US imperialism and threats to its world hegemony. But this is very, very unlike the situation in the 1920s, in the 1930s and 40s, when British imperialism's hegemony was first threatened and then eclipsed by US imperialism. Because this time, US imperialism is not threatened with being eclipsed by another imperialist hegemon. It's not how imperialism works. Imperialism is an exclusive club. It's not possible for oppressed countries to join it. You know, that would contradict Lenin's understanding of imperialism. And it also contradicts experience. I mean, only one relatively minor imperialist power has emerged in virgin territory since the First World War, when the advanced capitalist countries tore themselves apart and gave birth to the October Revolution. And that was Israel. And that was transplanted in an artificial manner, the social and political expression of a distinct layer within the existing imperialist bourgeoisies that for their own unique reasons sought their own national state. But Russia and China don't fit that model at all. They're both products of the decay of the world revolution and of the failure of imperialism to replenish itself, proof of the nature of imperialist capitalism as a system in decay and decline. They're anomalous hybrid forms of capitalism, whose capitalism, instead of replicating imperialism, is very much marked by its origins in states that for decades were degenerated forms of the dictatorship of the proletariat. And neither imperialism nor they are historically viable. Imperialism is reactionary through and through. But these states are at odds with it. They're at odds with it, but they are anomalous byproducts of a temporary decline and setback of the world revolution. That's how we see it. But the road to revolution is still through the defeat of imperialism. And the non-imperialist nature of these states and the fact that they're now forced to resist imperialism imposes a duty on the world working class to defend them against imperialism. This resistance to imperialism inspires an element of anti-imperialist consciousness in the working class who come to understand it, which is actually the road to revolutionary class consciousness. And a conscious understanding of how this paradox came to be, how these anomalous states in conflict with imperialism are products of revolutions that regressed or were born with deformations that hamstrung them from the start, point to the solution in class consciousness. A defeat for imperialism at the hand of these non-imperialist states points the road back to the revolution and the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat as the solution to the huge social, environmental, and cultural barbarism that imperialism is dragging us into. A successful defense of Russia and China and the defeat of imperialist hegemony points back to the need for the world revolution as the only thing that can save humanity from destruction at the hands of imperialist capitalism. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Ian, for that presentation. If everyone who is, including a few people who have just joined, could please mute themselves. It just stops the camera switching away from the speaker. So unless you're speaking, please put your microphone on mute. All right, great. Our next speaker is the Bolshevik Tendency, Alan Gibson from the Bolshevik Tendency. And I know it's hard, comrades, but if we could try and stick to approximately the 10-minute limit, that would be great. All right, thank you very much. Introducing the Bolshevik Tendency. Thank you.
Firstly, on behalf of the Bolshevik Tendency, I'd like to thank the organisers of this meeting for inviting us to speak. As the other speakers so far have mentioned, we are gathered here to discuss a critical issue for the international working class in this period that is characterised by the loss of global hegemony for American imperialism, and, on the other hand, the role of other powers, including Russia, in shaping an increasingly multipolar geopolitical world order. We'd also agree that the origins of the current military conflict between Russia and the Ukrainian proxy of US-led Western imperialism can be traced to the 1991 capitalist counter-revolution, as we have outlined in our published materials. The US has sought to expand NATO throughout Russia's near abroad by enlisting the countries of the former Warsaw Pact. It's important to recognize the long-term strategic objective of the US, as described by Dick Cheney when he was Defense Secretary under George W. Bush, and Zbigniew Brzezinski, General Carter's National Security Advisor, and that is to dismember Russia and create 3, 4, or 5 smaller, more pliable, that is, exploitable states. For the past several decades, the economic weight of the US and its imperialist partners in NATO, as well as Japan and Australia, in the global economy has been declining, while China, where collectivized property relations remain dominant, has been steadily gaining ground on its advanced capitalist peers. The global economy is at the edge of a major economic crisis that will dwarf the 2008 crisis. And even before the impact of the COVID pandemic, global capitalism was clearly showing signs that a major profitability crisis was in the offing. Now, as the sanctions against Russia spectacularly backfire, most notably in Europe, where exploding energy price rises are driving the most serious cost of living escalation in generations, international capitalism stands on the brink of the most dire economic crisis since the Great Depression. Russia's economic engagement with the world, particularly the former Soviet republics, is primarily categorized by selling commodities, particularly oil and gas, and selling that at prices lower than those on the current world market. Rather than extracting super profits in its near abroad or anywhere else for that matter, Russia derives most of its income from energy sales, largely to Europe. It must be recognized that Russia is not a predatory imperialist power, despite its formidable military, but rather essentially a dependent capitalist country. As the other speakers have mentioned so far, and I'm sure the other speakers tonight will also mention, a military victory for Russia over Zelensky's US-backed Ukraine will strike a powerful blow against global imperialism, just as the Russian defeat will embolden the US and its NATO stooges for further aggression in the Indo-Pacific, particularly against the Chinese deformed workers' state. That is why revolutionaries side with Russia in the current military conflict, while refusing to offer any political support to Putin's Bonapartist anti-working class regime. We took the same attitude toward the struggle of the Taliban to drive the US and its NATO allies out of Afghanistan, for instance. This issue of offering military support to Russia in its struggle against the Ukrainian proxies of US NATO imperialism is an acid test for all those who claim to stand in the tradition of Lenin and Trotsky. Unfortunately, it is a test which most of those who claim the Bolshevik tradition have failed, with some taking a position in neutrality, while others siding with NATO's Ukrainian puppets. Alongside this, whilst the imperialist governments are throwing billions of dollars to prop up the Zelensky regime with the aim of weakening and ultimately destroying Russia, workers in the West are becoming increasingly restive as it becomes clear to them that this reckless military adventure, which is going to destroy much of Ukraine and cost many tens of thousands of lives, is going to be financed by slashing popular living standards in the NATO countries. I live in Ireland, and we can see that primarily over the issue of energy price increases. So intercepting that sentiment and making the link between the imperialist war drive and the cost of living crisis must be a central focus for Marxists in the coming period. This is because it is vital to communicate to the millions of working people turning against NATO's war in Ukraine that a Russian victory is in their direct material interests. On May Day, the Bolshevik tendency marched in London and Toronto under the slogan, US-NATO war drive against Russia and China hurts workers everywhere. The other groups speaking here today, who broadly share our perspective as I understand it, have put forward a variety of slogans, including, and these are some I found on your websites, victory to the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and their allies. US-NATO, hands off Russia, get out of Ukraine and Eastern Europe. For defeating imperialism and defending Russia and Donbass. It is necessary to support Russia in its battle with imperialism. We stand with Russia in this conflict. However, we note that the Worldwide Organising Network Against Fascism, Imperialism, Racism and Exploitation, or World on Fire for short, which most of the groups represented here today are affiliated with, avoids a clear statement of which side to support in its call out for action. Instead of making it clear that genuine anti-imperialists must side with Russia and its allies against NATO's client in Kiev, the propaganda put out by your bloc has a pacifist stop the war message. This is shown by the slogan proposed as the basis for common action that deals with the immediate conflict. You say, stop the war of US NATO imperialism against Russia. This is presumably due to the opportunist calculation that this will make it easier to get a hearing, and it probably will. But this comes at the political cost of blurring the key issue and end up echoing the slogans of the various larger formations of centrists, opportunists and left reformists whose opposition to NATO has an essentially pacifist quality. So we call on those of you who are seriously committed to the Bolshevik-Leninist tradition to heed Trotsky's injunction, made nearly 100 years ago, but which retains all its relevance for Marxists today. I'm sure you'll all recognize this. To face reality squarely, not to seek the line of least resistance, to call things by their right names, to speak the truth to the masses, no matter how bitter it may be. If we are to build a bloc which is clear on the distinction between the fake anti-imperialism of most of the left, it is necessary for that bloc to have it as part of its basis support for the victory of Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, and to the Bolshevik tendency for that. For those thoughts and perspective on the way forward. Our next speaker is Socialist Fight from Great Britain.
Okay. First of all, people have said a lot of the stuff that I was going to say, so I'll have to emphasize some other points. When Trotsky observed that imperialists do not fight for political principles, for markets, colonies, raw materials, for hegemony over the world and its wealth. That's what they're really fighting for. They're not fighting for any principles whatsoever, and therefore it really is shameful to see a whole section of the so-called self-declared Trotskyist left capitulating to NATO, capitulating to the whole war propaganda that we've seen, led by Chris Ford and his Ukraine Solidarity campaign, followed by USEC, followed by a number of other organizations that are self-declared Trotskyists. It has been mentioned that of course there are other opponents who are what we might call slightly to the left of that. They are well, the Stop the War people. The Stop the War people basically their slogans is a pacifist. They're pacifist slogans. Scurvy pacifists, in fact, is what Trotsky dubbed them in the middle of that situation, because central to all their demands is the demand to withdraw Russian troops. To withdraw Russian troops is to demand the victory of NATO and the US. There's no other construction you can put on that demand. I had a letter published in the Morning Star a week ago, and it quoted from the Morning Star's pacifist solution: respect for Ukraine, solidarity and statehood, democratic self-determination for minorities within its borders, disentanglement from NATO control, and genuine neutrality overseen by potent forms of international guarantees. Now, who would provide the international guarantees in a potent form? Maybe that would be the United Nations. But of course, we all know the United Nations is basically controlled by the United States. And anyway, there's the veto of Russia and China over allowing that to happen. What's really happened in Ukraine is that after the Maidan coup, after the advance of the far right, and we must remember that the far right, the Azov battalion, the right sector, etc., they are not an autonomous group as such. They are sponsored and trained by the United States itself. In Victoria Nuland's colorful phrase, "Fuck the EU, we want Yats." So she's nominating the next president, and she's saying that it's not just surrounding Russia that's our aim. It's also bringing Europe to heel, bringing Germany and France to heel, which is that is the program of the United States. Well, it has succeeded up to a point, but we know that the effects of the war are going to be felt more severely in Europe than anywhere else, and are being felt right now more severely in Europe than anywhere else. But that does not mean that the United States itself is able to escape from the consequences of this war. The United States can't escape from the consequences of the war because, as has been mentioned already, the sanctions on Russia have spectacularly backfired. Despite I read articles in the Observer, for instance, by commentators who are absolutely outraged at this. Basically, they're saying, "You absolute bastards! You have forced us to shoot ourselves in the foot with these sanctions, and now we're going to have to shoot ourselves in the other foot by maintaining them." And that situation then has curious global effects, because contrary to all expectations, the people that Russia can now sell its oil to include India, include actually Saudi Arabia, unbelievably, because of Saudi Arabia's relationship with China, and even the IMF's most supine supporter in South Africa, Ramaphosa. Even Ramaphosa must now oppose. He has no option because of what's happening. So the whole of Africa and a whole section there are beginning to consider trading in their own currencies, and China and Russia are beginning to trade with the ruble and the yen renminbi. So that situation is undermining the global hegemony of the dollar. Now, the global hegemony of the dollar is absolutely crucial the plans of the United States by the global hegemony of the dollar. It was able to force almost every country in the world that had a domination over to subsidize its own economy, to subsidize its own debt. So that is now seriously beginning to come under threat. As for, I think it's been sufficiently explained that Russia can't be regarded as an imperialist power because of its total inability to do what the IMF and the World Bank does to countries in Africa, for instance. But it's also our contention that although China is clearly a capitalist country now and has been really since the aftermath, something around the October 1993, the aftermath of the Tiananmen Square. It has, for instance, 1,058 billionaires, something like 4.5 million millionaires. To call that a deformed worker state, it's I think a bit of a joke in this situation. And even the nationalized properties that operate, even they operate under capitalist norms. They're there to subsidize the income of the ruling bureaucracy. A few more points. It is also clear that there are a major ideological crisis developing in the West. This is the third Zoom meeting I've been on today. The first Zoom meeting was on the Greater London Association of Trades Councils, where it was pointed out what absolute reactionary role the TUC was playing in trying to stop the development of the grassroots movement from the Trades Council. Very, very hostile. The second meeting also emphasized that, and the situation that is now developing means that the first meeting that the new King Charles III had was with Liz Truss, and of course the meeting with Liz Truss is discussing the bringing in of dictatorship in Britain, the making of strikes illegal, and of course using the Ukraine war as an ideological cover for that. That will be one of the main things, and shockingly, absolutely shockingly, the whole of the trade union movement, the TUC, the Mick Lynch, who was supposed to be the great ideological leader that was leading the class struggle, he apologized and he gave his allegiance to the Queen, and of course his great hero was James Connolly, who none did better than James Connolly in saying what a farce the monarchy was. So that's the ideological crisis. And the last ideological crisis I want to refer to is the statement of Roger Waters of Pink Floyd, who has defied almost the entire artistic establishment in the United States and Britain in opposing the war in Ukraine, and saying that Zelensky should make concessions to Russia, etc., etc. Well, it mightn't be the full thing, but on the other side, the people that have given full support to the war in Ukraine from the artistic side is Billy Elliot, MacDonald, Elton John, Stevie Wonder, Bruce Springsteen, Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, The Who, Roger Daltrey, Pete Townsend. It's a shocking list of ideological collapse. The trade union movement, the whole lot have gone down that road. So that's all I want to say, really. Well, the last point I was say that anti-fascism and anti-imperialism is the key. That's what we say now, but of course that doesn't mean that we have forgotten what is the ultimate key. And the ultimate key is when you raise the consciousness of the working class by a defeat of imperialism, it must also be on your agenda to raise the overthrow of Putin and the regime in Ukraine by workers' revolution, but by posing it now as the immediate task when it is clearly not on the agenda and there is no movement towards it, it is in actual fact to assist US imperialism and NATO. That is a false demand. It is a propaganda demand for where we want to go, but to put it as the immediate task is in fact to assist NATO and to assist the US. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Jerry from Socialist Fight. I know that I've said to try and keep your things to 10 minutes, so I'm going to give some slightly contradictory thing here too, and also say we've also got a comrade who is attempting to translate into Portuguese for some of the people on the line. So just be aware to try and speak clearly as well, and pace yourself. They're not going to get everything, but if they could slow it down slightly, that will help them with the translation. I also apologize for the appearance of social chauvinism in the order of the lineup, but it was really done just purely on that it's late in Europe and then kind of following the time backwards from latest to earliest in the day. So we're moving on from Europe now. We're going to hop down to Australia, and I'd like to introduce the Anti-War West Sydney group. Thank you.
Thank you, Davey. I'm glad to have got an invitation to speak. I'll try and speak clearly but quickly. A conundrum to start with. We must ask why we have to raise such a slogan as stop US wars on Russia and stop US wars on China as a rallying demand. Why would it not be obvious to left, progressive, socialist and forces that call themselves Marxist that, to quote the most conscious and committed elements of USA's working class, that we must stop the US war machine to save the planet, and that many of the world's woes point to USA as the elephant in the room. It is strange that we're coming from so far out of left field to raise the demands that should be the centre of the left and working class and peace movement demands. Here I must say I've been totally disgusted by the European left, democratic, socialist, Stalinist or once Trotskyist, that after 80 years of US military occupation, the best it could manage was to squeal Russia out from behind the skirts of the Western European bourgeoisie. I can't see that as doing anything but having built trouble for itself. The USA has declared itself the world's first, last and only truly global empire. That's Ziggy Brzezinski in 1986. It's the initiator of the new world order, as George H.W. Bush said in September 1990. Since 2017, USA has nominated Russia and China as existential threats and revisionist powers that threaten USA's rule-based world order, as in US rules, okay? Inherent in these concepts are powerful indicators of US ambitions of global domination that it may be willing to enforce by any means up to and including the threat of nuclear war. You would think such statements as above would cause global uproar, but they haven't. Since waging the first Gulf War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the peace and anti-war movement, and above all the left, including especially many of those who call themselves Marxists, have been in a state of confusion as to the causes, responsibilities, and even the victims when it comes to responding to the rash of wars and other aggressions such as embargoes that have been unleashed by the USA since the 90s. After a century of failure by the European left, the left in the imperialist countries generally, there's a situation of extreme disorientation matched with increasing irrelevance and diversion from basic tenets that has paved the way for capitalist reaction in imperialist countries. We've largely been trapped in the matrix of worldviews and the knowledge manufactured by the ruling classes of imperialism. We deny humanity's heroic efforts and progress to overthrow imperialism and colonialism as a part of the world revolution that emerged from the contradictions of capitalism itself. And the corollary of this is that the left seems totally confused as to what imperialism is. I recall Trotsky defending Emperor Haile Selassie from Italian aggression once. These days, many leftists would probably call that situation as one of competing imperialisms. So I think that's how far we're gone. To understand imperialism, to put it in its historical context, I turn first to Marx's summation of the world historical mission of capital. That is to say, the logical conclusion of the laws of operating under capital. And he says in Capital 3, to paraphrase, the capitalist mode of production is an historical means of developing the material forces of production and creating an appropriate world market. At the same time, there's a continual conflict between this, its historical task, and its own corresponding relations of social production, because capital and its self-expansion solely appear as the starting and the closing point, the motive and the purpose of production. Production's only production for capital and not to expand the living process of the society of producers, because the preservation and self-expansion of the value of capital can only work or proceed through the expropriation and pauperization of the great mass of producers. So it comes continually into conflict with its limited purpose, the self-expansion of existing capital and the full panoply of the forces that it releases. The real barrier, says Marx, of capitalist production is capitalist self. Well, to put it more simplistically, because capitalist production is based on expropriation, pauperation of the great masses of workers in its quest to maximise capital, among other dehumanising things this does is it stifles abilities people to use or consume what collectively they produce. So it continuously generates crises for itself, which it resolves through destruction of existing capitals, then an expansion of new capitals. The historical vehicle for this expansion of capital, this logical development, is imperialism and colonialism, the form that particular capitalist states have taken to enable their national capitals to capture new markets and resource bases from which to extract and maximise their profits and suppress competition. By the time Lenin contended with imperialism, he was recognising this law of capital motion in more concrete form as it progressed into a more mature and even culminating or definitive stage as it completed the process of becoming a world market. Many Marxists and communists and socialists refer to Lenin on imperialism. So what does he say? Lenin outlines 5 basic features, the basic purely economic concepts by which to define imperialism, which briefly, concentration of production and capital developed at such a high stage, it's created monopolies, which play a decisive role in economic life, the merging of bank capital with industrial capital, creating on the basis of this financial capital and a financial oligarchy, Export of capital is distinguished from export of commodities becomes exceptionally important, and the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which shall share the world amongst themselves, and a territorial division of the world amongst the biggest capital powers has already been completed. The argues are over the redivisions. This is often used mechanistically, ticking off trays to determine how imperialist the state being examined or categorised is. It can be used to construct comparative systems, for instance, or hierarchies of imperialisms. Yet Lenin hedges the use of these defining features in analysing imperialism with qualifications. He says, very brief definitions, though convenient, for they sum up the main points, are nevertheless inadequate, since we must deduce from them some especially important features of the phenomenon that has to be defined. And he also says, we shall later see that imperialism can and must be defined differently if we bear in mind not only the basic purely economic concepts to which the above definition is limited, he says, but also the historical place of this stage of capitalism in relation to capitalism in general, or the relationship between imperialism and the two main trends in the working class movement. The thing to be noted at this point is that imperialism, as interpreted above, undoubtedly represents a special stage in the development of capitalism. You can't throw the word around meaning any and everything sort of capitalist tendencies. In other words, if we cannot understand imperialism in real time, we cannot understand imperialism in real time by a cladistic grading of nation states by means of 5 trays of features. We must behold it holistically and non-mechanistically so we can see where we are within capitalism's historical progression and how imperialism stirs the working class movement, example by creating 2 main trends or countercurrents. And so consider the most effective ways from there to unite the world's working class against imperialism, against global monopoly capitalism as it exists at the time we are talking about. If we view the world historical stage in its completeness, as in my opinion the Chinese communists do, we can see and place ourselves in other events within the period of the world's revolutionary transformation from a capitalist class society into a classless world communist society, well into its 2nd century of transformation. This transformation, if we start with the revolutions of 1848, and more than 100 years if we count from the Great October Revolution, and likely with generations to go yet. To deny the validity of the Soviet Union Comecon, the Chinese Revolution, the Cubas, the Nicaraguas, the Venezuelas, the DPRKs, etc., and the interactivity of these outbursts of revolutionary energy on each other, and their validity as historically progressive integral steps in this transformation, is ultimately self-defeating, because it's saying that far from being capitalism's gravediggers, the proletarian and the working class revolutions have proven incapable of any lasting victories in over 150 years against capital. We'll come back to that in a moment if I get a chance. But now let's look at one power that is undoubtedly imperial. In fact, it claims to be the world's first, last, and only truly global empire. It claims to be the world's global hegemon, the sole power with the right to crack any power that might challenge it. You would think it's a no-brainer that this is the most dangerous entity currently on the planet, but apparently many cannot see it, let alone see its hands in multifarious events and situations. I want to look at Ziggy Brzezinski's proclamations in the grand chessboard, just to show that US imperialism is not just any imperialism. There he states, the American entrepreneurial economic model stresses global free trade and uninhibited competition. As imitation of American ways gradually pervades the world, it creates a more congenial setting for the exercise of indirect and seemingly consensual American hegemony. That involves a complex structure of interlocking institutions and procedures designed to generate consensus and obscure asymmetries in power and influence. American global supremacy is thus buttressed by an elaborate system of alliances and coalitions that literally span the globe. In promoting this American entrepreneurial economic model, Brzezinski disparages the then Western European economic model, its welfare state, including its German emphasis on co-determination between entrepreneurs and trade unions, and the pervasive decline in Europe's internal vitality from an excessively burdensome welfare system sapping its economic vitality, resulting in more Europeans voicing the opinion, de Ziggy apparently, that the competitive and even ruthless American economic culture has to be emulated if Europe is not to fall further behind. I think we call that the Atlanticist Europe. So to clarify, the US empire is not promoting democracy in general, or even social democracy, which at least recognises some role for labour as a co-determinant in a pluralist socio-economy, let alone expressing tolerance anywhere in its world system for a democracy that embraces socialism or communism. Brzezinski, in fact, is describing the world liberal democratic order that serves capital, specifically finance capital. And people can look at Michael Hudson and super imperialism on this if they want to follow it up further. To create its finance capital effort to create an appropriate world market to maximise its power to extract profits over the needs or interests of society and the workers and people at large. USA is the world executor of the neoliberal order, laissez-faire for business in the era of global monopoly capital. At its core is a complex of interconnected US global corporations and institutions with an attendant US war machine to serve their interests. As for poorer countries of the world, with the hundreds of millions of unemployed and increasingly restless young, whose level of frustration is growing at an exponential rate, says Brzezinski, only a sustained and directed American involvement will prevent international anarchy, and the threat of war cannot be discounted in this case because these countries are outside those parts of the world where US power has been reinforced by democratic socio-political systems and elaborate external multilateral, but also US-dominated frameworks. So this is the way US realises the neoliberal dream, the creation of an appropriate world market to allow an untrammeled expropriation and pauperisation of the great mass of producers for capital and its external expansion, being based on financial capital and international monopolist capitalist associations which share the world among themselves, but which are all contained just the same in US-dominated frameworks. So that is the working out of Marx's exposure of what the historic role of capital and contradictory self-defeating role of capital is to create a world market in its own image. And this vision, of course, is not merely about national domination and alliance. Its aim is global, but it reaches right into the workplace everywhere under the prevailing neoliberal capitalist economy. Witness the restructuring of jobs in the workforce as industries automated and the gig economy spreads. It's loss of full-time work, loss of conditions, work security, and increasing difficult for labour to organise at workplace and industry level. We've been deliberately steered by neoliberal governments, including both Labour and Liberal or Conservative governments, into a cycle of economic restructuring, where increased labour productivity no longer sees a growth in wages or an improvement in workers' conditions, including their social wage. This is in the imperialist core countries where labour is being comparatively privileged compared to in the global south. The idea that all big powers, the competing imperialisms, are organised in this way is a myth that the left, and in particular the labour movement, must explore and dispel. I'll leave Russia as a special case other than to say it is only 30 odd years since the Soviet Union collapsed. Even now, Russia is treated by the West, the European Union and USA, as a country way past due time to be dismembered and ransacked of its resources. They're just a bit behind schedule, but still working on it. Class relations in the Soviet Union are fluid, and Putin's a Bonapartist figure who survives by his ability to balance the needs of the people and the new capitalist class. But he has at least reconstituted Russia as an autonomous nation state and turned the economy and living standards of many Russians around. The building alliance with the People's Republic of China is Russia choosing a new future, finally giving up hope to be part of a Europe under a fading world power. This is important to the global south that we don't hear much from in the imperialist core, that has quietly applauded Russia finally standing up to US and NATO in Ukraine, because they see here the chance of a multipolar world arrangement that will take the pressure of US imperialism with its IMF, World Bank instrumentalities of neo-colonial domination from off them, allowing them to escape from debt and allocate national resources to their own sovereign development. So the left in the imperialist core countries should be able to see that not all imperialism is the same. Some are not imperialist at all. And in relation to the People's Republic of China, the left in the imperialist hemisphere must have an obligation, surely, to look at the progress of China since its successful work as peasant revolution of 1949 and try to understand in terms of the centuries-long revolutionary transformation of capitalist class society into classless world communist or human society. When one world power advocates a world market that progresses through austerity and war, and another emerging world power enunciates a global community of nations with a shared destiny that aims for an ecological civilization, surely a politically informed person would be curious to find out more. Lastly, I will finish off with stating something that deserves a whole session of its own. That is, since the world of imperialism as revealed by Lenin, one world event that has spawned a whole progression of further events has occurred. The Russian Revolution that Lenin himself had a central leading role in. Since then, starting with the bloodbath against communists in Germany in 1919, the competition of capitals and the manoeuvring of empires, which has continued right up towards monopoly's unipolar moment when it comes to empires, have been circumscribed by capital and the imperialism's collective fear, the spectre of the communist revolution that would put an end to all their games. Do not see what's going on in the world even now with austerity at home, that is the crushing of whole labour forces, and war abroad aimed at those nations and movements not accepting capitalist hegemony, as usually tested by their willingness to subject their workers and economies to neoliberal reform, is to not understand anything that's going on in the world and to be left open to impressions and the propaganda of the oppressing classes who are constantly aiming to convince us our enemies are our allies and our friends are our enemies.
All right. Thank you very much, Wayne.
Did that come through all right?
Yes, thank you.
Right, good.
All right. So moving straight along to North America, as again, just following through according to from kind of latest to earliest, there was a bit of an exception there with Wayne, who actually wasn't speaking from Australia. But yeah, all right. So North America. So we'll start off with, from North America, we're going to have Class Conscious, Friends of the Soviet People, the Socialist Unity Party, and Partido Obrero Socialista from Costa Rica, and Mike Gimble. So we'll get through those. And I said, if people keep it conscious of time, that would be really helpful. Thank you very much. So starting up with Class Conscious. Robert Montgomery. Is he still with us?
Yes, can you see me?
Yep, beautiful.
Okay, Davey, if you could, around 8 minutes, kind of give me a buzz, and let me know that I'm approaching that 10-minute mark. And so I would also add that I'm going to read my remarks for purposes both of clarity, in terms of understanding what I'm saying, and time efficiency, and to avoid going off on tangents, which those tangential points are not unimportant. And I'm glad to hear other comrades have already kind of filled up those holes in what I'm going to be saying. So on this, the 200th day of the special military operation by Russia and its allied forces in the Donbass, the Russian forces are bogged down in a grinding war of attrition. And it's a war that it is not allowed to win. And I would say that one side, the imperialist side, is fighting a war. And it's putting everything into it. If you just take the United States, since February 24th, 55 billion, give or take 10 billion, has already been put in terms of all forms of aid into Ukraine. Russia is fighting a limited war. That's what the SMO is. It's limited. And it's basically kind of sitting on the territory that it's taken. And I'm not going to get into the major setback on the Izium front, south of Kharkov, at the end of last week. It's the first significant victory for the Ukrainian forces. And I would just add quickly that this has sparked a war conclave in Moscow to rethink its objectives and the very nature of the conflict. Who can say what they're going to do? Certainly, I would hope they are going to reinforce that front, and they will, and then to back up with more support, the Donbass militias, who are, as courageous as they are, and as long as they've been fighting, they're not a professional army, okay? And they're facing the best that Ukraine has in this counteroffensive that took the Russian forces by surprise. Okay? Actually, I wasn't going to say much about it, but it doesn't change anything. But on the other hand, it does highlight what it means to have a limited special military operation. I would remind people that Russia has not declared war on Ukraine. Not is fighting NATO. It has been unclear in terms of what its objectives really are. So anyway, as I said, it's a war that Russia and its allies are not allowed to win. Okay? The US is going all in on this, not to win it. It's just they won't tolerate a Russian victory, even if it means fighting to the last Ukrainian. In fact, the US isn't concerned with actual military victory in Ukraine. It will throw any number of Ukrainian cannon fodder into the fire, perhaps the entire country if necessary, counting on inflicting a staggeringly high death toll from a protracted war that bleeds Russia dry. The proxy insurgency will contribute to the destabilization of Russia. This is its intention, facilitating a long-planned regime change operation and the carving up of the country itself, as other speakers have pointed out. That's the objective of this. But it's also, the other objective is one front in what's going to be, and it's already begun to be with the Taiwan, Pelosi's visit to Taiwan provocation, a two-front war. But in order for imperialism, from their strategic point of view, to fight that two-front war, they've got to tie Russia down in Ukraine and on its borders. So this is, I think, even clearer now than it was when we met in March. So unlike the centrists, we can't get trapped into viewing this through the narrow national lens of Ukraine alone. The war must be seen in an international context. As Trotsky wrote in his 1928 critique of the draft program of the Communist International, the international program must proceed directly from an analysis of the conditions and tendencies of the world economy of the world political system taken as a whole in all its contradictions and connections. That is, with the mutually antagonistic interdependence of its separate parts. In the present epoch, the national orientation of the proletariat must and can flow only from a world orientation and not vice versa. Today, world capitalism is mired in deep crisis, as others have pointed out. Okay? The US rate of profit has not really recovered from the financial crisis of 2008. Yes, it's true, the mass of profits is increasing, okay? But the rate of profit is too low to sustain growth in real production. 60% of the growing mass of profit flows directly into financial markets. That's according to Alan Freeman, and Michael Hudson, I know, would say it's even higher than that. Okay, so I'll just take 60% out of every dollar of profit generated in this increasing mass of profits flowing basically into the energy sector very heavily, is going right into the fictitious capital of financialization. Fictitious capital is parasitizing on production, choking off new investment to a greater extent than at any time in the past 50 years. And it now demands a greater share of the world's surplus value in order to stay afloat. That's the world socialist surplus value, okay? Not simply the surplus value within the US itself, okay? That's something else again. It's entirely inadequate to keep this afloat, even though it will extract as much surplus value and intensify the rate of surplus value extraction in the US. American capitalism is using its productivity advantage to offload the crisis of valorization, which people have referred to what that is. The crisis of valorization is basically a crisis of profitability, okay, onto its European allies. Most of all, it is intensifying the looting of the global South, from which it has been draining value increasingly since 2008. The Federal Reserve in the US is responding to the inflationary crisis and the wage offensive of the working class by deliberately engineering a recession in the model of the Volcker shock treatment of the 1980s to create increased unemployment, to drive down wages, and it has nothing to do with fighting inflation. It will be stagflation, as we experienced in the 70s, but on a much higher level, a combination of stagnation in production and inflation at the same time. If anyone had lived through that like I did, and that was at 10% unemployment, 10% inflation, which we'll see at least that, okay? That's hard to describe, okay? It's just, we haven't experienced it yet in the US, but I did.
At about 8 minutes, Robert.
Thank you, Davey. Okay, moving along. Europe is looking at a new winter of discontent. Inflation in the UK is predicted to rise as high as 18%, and Goldman Sachs, I just read, says 22% by the end of the year. Half of British households are at risk of falling into poverty as a result of surging gas prices this winter. The NHS expects thousands to die because they can no longer afford to heat their homes. In Argentina, inflation is heading towards 70%. That was a couple of days ago when I wrote this, but now I see from Bloomberg that no, inflation right now in Argentina is 100%. Okay. The interest rate has climbed to 52% as the state tries to avert investors dumping peso assets. South America's third largest country is at the breaking point. And we just saw on September 1st, an assassination attempt by a fascist gunman on the life of Vice President Cristina de Fernandez Kirchner. Okay? And that fascist gunman is representative of a rising fascist movement that's expressed in this party. I don't know its name, but it has a Trumpian, like a monstrous character in its lead. I think it got 18% of the last vote, the recent vote. Okay, so basically to sum it up, comrades, we're on the cusp of two things at the same time. A working class upsurge, very much along the lines in Europe of the yellow vests in 2019, and that's already being called for in France. And on the other hand, a growing tendency towards state authoritarianism and even fascism on the other. The threat of fascism represents a great danger both in the imperialist centers and in the global South. Trump, Bolsonaro, Le Pen, and now this clown in Argentina, dangerous clown, must be taken seriously. And I'm sure there are others. The fastest growing, most aggressive sector of finance capital in the United States, the vulture firms of private equity capital, are supporting Trumpism. Okay, so the energy sector, Trumpism. And it may not be Trump, it may be DeSantis, whoever follows him. And it definitely will be one of them in 2024 as they've set these elections up. They've already rigged them. Okay, so it's going to be Trump or it's going to be DeSantis or Trump lookalike. Okay. The upsurge, of course, represents a great opportunity, but as we know, we lack revolutionary leadership. This is why we must build on efforts such as this panel to clarify our own thinking and to make links. We must continue towards the creation of a Zimmerwall left for the 21st century. The objective reality before us is that of imperialist war and imperialism. In just 20 years, not only in Europe, but in the Asia Pacific, to get to China, in just 20 years, China has surpassed the US as the world's leading trading partner. I would urge anyone to go on Google and look at that map. In 2000, I mean, there was like maybe 1 or 2 countries that had China as its major trading partner. Today, it's just kind of the EU core and a handful of other countries that don't have China as its major trading partner. Includes Australia and just about everybody else except, the EU core. China represents an intolerable challenge. One other point that I was just informed of, that life expectancy in China has now, after a long ascent, and a particularly steep one since 2000, has now surpassed that of the US. China represents an intolerable challenge to imperialism as both an economic and ideological competitor, as it remains a deformed worker state despite its large capitalist sector. I've written a whole paper on that, which people can read, and I would defend that absolutely. Okay, that I called it a weird beast before, which is something akin to what Ian Donovan was describing, but I think I have to call it what it is, as Alan Gibson says, that it remains a deformed worker state, because I don't know how they get through COVID with 14,000 deaths out of how many people, billion, whatever, and that's it, 14,000, where we had 1 million and they stopped counting. At 1 million, they stopped counting the dead in the US. So building an international anti-war movement is the order of the day. Our forces are small, but 4/5 of the world, in big terms, is with us. We must build links with broader forces. And I would just point out, even some of the centrists are in facing the reality of the consequences of the war in terms of the effect on their own working class, say in England and around the world as a whole, are breaking somewhat from the initial Russophobia of February 24th in the face of these emerging facts, reality. And the other centrist people have mentioned, who are with NATO, actually debating, the Morenoite currents actually debating whether it's legitimate to call for more NATO arms to Ukraine. Long thread we went through just recently on Facebook this week, unbelievable. But that is the reality of most of the centrists, the so-called, to our shame, Trotskyist groups, which they are not. Okay, they are not part of our movement. They have jumped the line, just like crossing a picket line. Okay. Mass protests are already beginning. 70,000 came onto the streets in Prague this week to demand an end to the EU-NATO war and to the inflation. But we must play our part to raise the banner of anti-imperialism and socialism at these protests. The two groups that dominated the Prague protest of 70,000 were the Czech Communist Party and the far right, the fascistic parties. So there's a big, there is a big gap there and a big danger from the right, okay, which is being sparked very much a kind of resurgent nationalism by the war. Okay. And so I would end just saying on to the creation of a Zimmerwall left onto building a international anti-war movement. I think that is the route to a new communist international. It flows from the road from a new Zimmerwald left through that path to the eventual gathering of forces to launch what we so badly lack and need, and that is a new communist international. So down with fascism and victory to socialism. So thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here today with all you comrades.
Thank you very much, Robert. All right, so we'll move on next to Friends of the Soviet People in the US.
Can you hear me?
Yep, you could maybe speak a little bit louder.
How about that? Is that better?
That's great.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. So like Davey mentioned, my name is Mike, and I represent an organization called U.S. Friends of the Soviet People. We are an organization that seeks to support struggles to restore socialism in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union after the counter-revolution in 1991. And I believe it is important for us to start back in 1991, at the time when American hegemony was claiming victory over the socialist forces. The famed not 1 inch east proposal that the U.S. had agreed to with then General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev was meant to be an assurance that the Eurasian landmass would be free from NATO interference and expansion. However, as we all know, this would not last as imperialist forces continued to push farther east into Eastern Europe. One by one, the former Soviet countries were absorbed into the organization. Yugoslavia was broken apart to make way for a military base in Kosovo, and within decades, NATO was now dangerously close to Russia's borders. In 2014, the US would fund and take part in the Euromaidan in Ukraine, allowing reactionary and fascist forces to take over the country. In the coming months, Russian citizens living in the Ukraine would be subject to abuse, killings, and other acts of terror. Ultimately, this would result in the Donbass region seceding and becoming independent states. Ukraine would then lead a bloody campaign for over 8 years that resulted in over 14,000 citizens being killed by Ukrainian forces and their neo-Nazi forces as well, terrorized the people in the Donbass. This is what has led us to the events spiraling in front of us today that we must act upon. The US-NATO alliance has sought regime change in Russia not only since the counter-revolution in 1991, but since 1917, when Russia overthrew the Tsar in the Bolshevik Revolution. America has always painted the Russian people as outsiders to the European project, as people who are uneducated and callous. We even see this Russophobia fomenting in the way Russians are deemed orcs by far-right forces and the various ways they have been harassed, beaten, and killed for years. American media has laid the grounds for this current manifestation of Russian prejudice and hatred by the virulent ways it portrays them in every medium, from movies featuring Russians as main antagonists who are determined to destroy the US, as well as military propaganda present in video games that proclaim around every corner and in every country Russians are poised to take over the entire world. But it's these exact portrayals that the US is guilty of. Countless coups, counter-revolutions, and assassinations carried out in countries on every continent. The idea of a multipolar world is simply unacceptable to the United States. NATO is willing to sacrifice the entire population of Ukraine to weaken Russia. When history looks back on the current proxy war, it will be the US, EU, NATO alliance whose hands will be responsible for the blood spilled. We must also speak about the propaganda war being waged against the People's Republic of China and Washington's long attempts at destabilizing the country and the Communist Party of China. The US government itself has admitted that the NED funded forces in Xinjiang to foment unrest in the region. Recently, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has taken it upon herself to visit Taiwan and proclaim she, quote, stands in solidarity with the island. The US has long used Taiwan to keep a foothold in the region and to further delay the inevitable reunification with mainland China. The tensions being stoked by American imperialism are further causing harm to the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean populations living in the US. Hate crimes soar when mainstream media proclaim China a deadly enemy that must be stopped by any means. As with Russia and so with China, the US is only interested in total spectrum dominance and a unipolar order that allows them to engage in the worldwide looting of countries' resources. The crisis of US imperialism has left the working class in the country, as well as in Europe, in a further precarious state. Workers in several states in America deal with unsafe drinking water, power outages with poor infrastructure, outrageous housing conditions, and costs. Yet the US establishment has given untold billions of dollars to defense companies and abroad. Instead of allowing for a ceasefire and negotiation between Russia and Ukraine, arms sales are skyrocketing. In Europe, the population is being told that they must be willing to sacrifice everything for the cause of Ukraine. Mass unrest is growing, and it is up to anti-fascist forces around the world to be there when the public becomes disillusioned. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to the Friends of the Soviet People. All right, our next speaker is Socialist Unity Party from the US. I'd like to introduce them.
Thank you, Davey. I'm Melinda Butterfield from the Socialist Unity Party. And I want to thank the organizers, first of all, for continuing this great series of opportunities for us to share and develop ties with one another. Today, the capitalist media is rapturous with news of the advance of the Ukrainian counteroffensive and the withdrawal of Russian troops from the Kharkov region. Less is being said about why and how this counteroffensive was made possible. The massive intervention of the Pentagon and NATO to shore up their faltering proxy war against Russia. Last week, as the Ukrainian offensive was taking shape, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken made a surprise visit to Kiev to pledge another $2.8 billion in military aid from Washington. For those keeping track, that brings the total in public US aid to Ukraine this year to a whopping $16.5 billion, which is more than the annual gross domestic product of 98 countries, according to the UN. This has been described as the largest single arms transfer in US history. It's also an enormous transfer of wealth to the military-industrial bourgeoisie. But in reality, as Comrade Robert alluded to a little while ago, this is just the tip of a very large iceberg that includes not only covert US funding, but also weapons, troops, and mercenaries from US-controlled NATO alliance countries. Blinken's visit was not really a surprise. It was the latest, in fact, in a long string of visits by high-ranking US officials to give marching orders to the puppet regime in Kiev. These visits date back to the very beginning of the war against Donbass in 2014 and 2015, when it was then Vice President Joe Biden, among others, who delivered the orders. The continuing infusion of massive amounts of money and weapons to the war zone removes any illusion that the Ukrainian conflict is just a brief episode in the new Cold War against Russia and China. On the contrary, the way Washington has doubled down at a time of growing economic crisis for the masses in the US and Europe shows that the ruling class intends this war to continue for a long time, to break up and dominate the Russian Federation. But they also feel the urgency to make tangible headway quickly. The ability to seduce large sections of the US population to stand with Ukraine has waned sharply with the accumulating crises facing the working class. Inflation is only the most obvious. The Biden administration is spending billions on war abroad and police at home, while funds for public health, the pandemic eviction ban, climate crisis, and education are eviscerated. This contradiction cannot be papered over forever. And of course, as many comrades have already noted, the situation will sharpen even more quickly among the West European NATO powers, which face the prospect of winter without access to cheap Russian fuel. The efforts of the organizations represented here for a genuine anti-imperialist position in the movement is making headway, however painfully slow. Here in the US, for example, this past week, the United National Anti-War Coalition has finally called for a week of action around US threats to Russia and China for mid-October. There are many factors in this decision by them, but the impact of events like this one, and on our part, I think of John Parker's visit to the Donbass frontline in May and reports back from that, influencing the rank and file of the left. That's significant. There's, from the very beginning, but even more so now, there's been genuine disillusionment and frustration with many rank and file forces in the left organizations and the anti-war movement generally, with the complete abandonment of street actions and any kind of significant opposition to the war. The importance of the Donbass struggle continues to be underappreciated, if not outright ignored by most left forces around the world. If the people of Donbass are considered at all, it is as a mere adjunct or tool of Russia. In fact, the relationship is quite different and dialectical. The explosion of resistance in eastern Ukraine after the Maidan coup in 2014, particularly in Donbass, the most working class region of Ukraine, was a tremendous breakthrough in reviving anti-fascist consciousness and internationalist solidarity rooted in the Soviet period. It reverberated through the people of all the former Soviet countries, and particularly Russia. There's a reason why Soviet flags and banners of victory are everywhere in the current anti-fascist military operation. It's not that Putin is trying to restore the USSR, as the Western media claim, or put something over on the global left. He and the Russian ruling class would love nothing more than to be rid of those symbols. But they reflect the genuine consciousness of the most active elements of the Soviet people about the stakes of the war, even 3 decades after the destruction of the USSR. Imagine trying to build an anti-imperialist movement against the Vietnam War while ignoring the struggle of the Vietnamese people. And yet, this is the standard position of the Western left on the conflict in Ukraine. The anti-fascist military alliance has succeeded in liberating much of Donetsk and Lugansk from Ukrainian occupation. But as they have advanced, Ukrainian troops have been concentrated in the well-defended areas west of the capital of Donetsk. And all summer, this has meant unrelenting, daily, brutal Ukrainian attacks on the civilian population of the city, which includes raining thousands of small anti-personnel mines on the streets, where children, senior citizens, and emergency workers have been the main victims. This heroic population, which has held strong for more than 8 years of war, is today under the worst siege of the war. The morale of this anti-fascist city is absolutely crucial to the outcome of this struggle. We must elevate the plight of the people of Donetsk and expose the grotesque war crimes of the US and Ukraine. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much to the Socialist Unity Party and Melinda for that powerful presentation. So next we've got the Socialist Workers' Party of Costa Rica.
Hello. Hola. Reciban un cordial saludo, compañeros y compañeras de las diferentes organizaciones. Somos el Partido Obrero Socialista de Costa Rica. El Partido Obrero Socialista de Costa Rica está agradecido con este espacio para la discusión sobre los problemas centrales que enfrenta el sistema capitalista y poder caracterizar los acontecimientos con el objetivo de plantear salidas para la clase trabajadora en los distintos escenarios, tanto donde se vive la guerra imperialista, como en aquellos países donde de una u otra manera se reciben las consecuencias de la crisis del sistema. El sistema capitalista, en su fase imperialista de decadencia, continúa su camino de descomposición y barbarie. Esto lo tenemos claro al ver cómo Estados Unidos ha utilizado la influencia de la OTAN para poder expandirse y seguir el acoso contra aquellos países o naciones que no se someten a sus dictados y que además tienen características históricas particulares que les son una piedra de zapato, son un impedimento para su dominio mundial. Los Estados Unidos, a pesar de la crisis del sistema, pretende seguir manteniendo su hegemonía capitalista frente al resto de naciones o bloques de naciones que aún dependen en gran medida del dólar como moneda comercial mundial, con la cual este imperialismo obtiene enormes ganancias y definitivamente no pretende ceder esta ventaja en el uso de la moneda. Pero además, el acoso permanente contra Rusia y contra China por la disputa de los mercados le ha permitido al imperialismo norteamericano en los últimos años acrecentar e incentivar el mercado de armas para probarlas y venderlas a aquellos países guardianes de sus intereses en diferentes partes del mundo. Por otra parte, Estados Unidos pretende aferrarse a su hegemonía imperialista heredada del siglo pasado, tanto de la Primera Guerra Mundial como también después de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, donde encontró que de igual manera iba a tener que enfrentar a un bloque que se iba a ser opositor, en este caso la Unión Soviética, la cual tuvo un desarrollo técnico, tecnológico, científico, armamentístico, que le permite a la Rusia o a la Federación Rusa de hoy día poder surgir después de la pretendida pero no lograda instauración del capitalismo por parte de Occidente en 1991. La guerra que está librando el imperio estadounidense actualmente en Ucrania es justamente el resultado o tiene el objetivo de mantener esa presión y esa hegemonía sobre el mundo capitalista. Ante esta posición, tenemos claro que Rusia y China no son imperialismos y que estos países están planteando la multilateralidad como una utópica salida, pero realmente la multilateralidad no es una posibilidad dentro del capitalismo en decadencia e imperialista. Es una trampa en el fondo, porque Estados Unidos no va a repartir sus ventajas en el mercado con el uso del dólar, por ejemplo, como mencionamos, y el poder militar que le permite sostener esta ventaja. Así como la idea del socialismo autárquico en un solo país que se aplicó en tiempos de la Unión de Repúblicas Socialistas Soviéticas no funcionó en su ideal de coexistencia pacífica con el capitalismo, tampoco el ideal de la construcción del socialismo en un solo país, incorporando elementos del mercado capitalista en la estructura productiva, va a tener resultados positivos a largo plazo, como pueden pretenderlo en la burocracia de China, porque la burguesía imperialista aplicará los mecanismos que considere necesarios para agotarlos, para desgastarlos, ya sea mediante la sofocación y conmociones internas, o también usando el recurso militar para liquidar este proyecto de embellecer de alguna manera o poner un rostro humano al sistema en decadencia. Por ejemplo, como hemos visto en algunas declaraciones, el imperialismo norteamericano ya busca desgastar a Rusia usando como escenario Ucrania y Europa, que es lo que hemos visto a lo largo de estos 200 días, y seguirá armando ese escenario bélico necesario para acorralar a estos países de economía mixta que han pasado por procesos revolucionarios y que siguen siendo un obstáculo para los objetivos del imperialismo, dado que, por ejemplo, luego de la caída de la burocracia de la Unión de Repúblicas Socialistas Soviéticas, no lograron instaurar el capitalismo como pensaban hacerlo. Y no lograron destruir la esencia del Estado, que en este caso es el ejército, ¿verdad? Que aunque ahora es ejército de la Federación Rusa, en sumo es un ejército que mantiene viva una trayectoria, una composición que es heredada de la revolución de 1917 y del desarrollo de la Unión Soviética. Lo mismo pasa con el ejército de la revolución en China, que no ha sido sustituido, no ha sido anulado y sigue siendo pieza clave fundamental para el desarrollo de el Estado chino. En cuanto a la situación en Ucrania, debemos señalar la importancia de que todos los ucranianos se unan para que no haya más apoyo a esta guerra. Debe haber una exigencia para poner en un alto al reclutamiento de civiles ucranianos que van a morir por los intereses únicamente del gobierno servil que hay en Ucrania en favor del imperialismo. Consideramos que los ucranianos deben unirse para que acaben los ataques contra los territorios de sus hermanos vecinos del Donbass y que de una vez pongan a tambalear y derriben el gobierno autoritario, neonazi y servil de Zelensky y le den un duro golpe al imperialismo norteamericano. Los demás pueblos del mundo también tenemos la posibilidad no solamente de unirnos y denunciar y exigir el fin de la guerra imperialista de Estados Unidos en Ucrania. Además, debemos alzar la voz contra las sanciones aplicadas contra Rusia y que hoy afectan al mundo entero, aumentando el costo de la vida y de otra forma también, al mantener esta guerra, va a lesionar directamente los intereses de la clase trabajadora. Los habitantes de Europa reciben hoy las consecuencias de las políticas de sus gobiernos que, fieles a su tradición histórica capitalista, insisten en mantener las sanciones que van a seguir afectando de alguna manera a Rusia, pero que ellos también reciben como consecuencia limitantes en sus recursos energéticos y también la destrucción inclusive de las fuentes de empleo que van a afectar directamente a la clase trabajadora. Es por esto que la clase trabajadora y organizaciones de nuestros países, de aquellos que no están directamente implicados, deben levantar la voz por cualquier pueblo que esté siendo agredido por los Estados Unidos y la OTAN. Mantenemos nuestro llamado a defender todas las naciones agredidas y acosadas por el imperialismo en América Latina, en Europa, en Asia, en África, pero también planteamos que dentro del capitalismo no hay alternativa. La única salida es el socialismo mundial. Tanto Rusia como las naciones vecinas que conforman parte de la Unión de Repúblicas Socialistas Soviéticas o que formaban parte de la Unión de Repúblicas Socialistas Soviéticas, como también China, deben dar el paso hacia la estatización de los principales sectores productivos, la nacionalización de la banca, porque no hay posibilidades de repartir amistosamente las ganancias con el imperialismo hegemónico del dólar. El socialismo mundial es la salida. Las federaciones de naciones socialistas son la única salida, no solo para acabar con la decadencia del sistema capitalista, sino también para frenar la escalada de la guerra, que es el último recurso de la burguesía imperialista para asegurarse el poder del mercado y el control del sistema capitalista, como lo vimos durante el siglo pasado. Muchas gracias. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the Socialist Workers' Party of Costa Rica. Our final speaker from North America is Comrade Mike Gimbel, and then we'll be moving on to our comrades from South America. So introducing Mike. Mike, you have to unmute yourself. Sorry, mate. Mike.
Yes. Okay, you can hear me now, right? Yeah, before I speak to my prepared remarks, I do want to say something about what's happening in the Ukraine right now, because I think I want to correct something that I'm hearing here. Yes, I see the same facts you see, what's happened the last 3 days. However, I have a different view of what's happening. I think this counterattack by Ukraine is going to end up being one of the great military blunders you'll ever see, and will be viewed that way. So I just want to, say that because I see too much on the Facebook and everybody. People, there's this panic. Hold your breath. Okay, now to my comments. Comrades, every person on this planet will be affected by the current world military crisis in the Ukraine and Taiwan. We are on the verge of World War III. We have to see it that way. The threat of World War III is why I'm here, I hope while you're here, and why your people are watching this forum. But my question is, where is the worldwide communist movement at this critical moment in human history? Why are they not participating on this panel? Mass anti-NATO demonstrations are already beginning in Europe. Why are these parties absent from this forum? Why aren't they creating public support for Russia and the Donbass in this fight to defeat US-sponsored fascism and NATO? Russia has hit the fascists in the mouth, but these communists have run the other way, often using pacifist slogans in this critical moment. We are in a new Zimmerwald moment in history where a new communist leadership in the mass struggle must be created. We hope that we can be a part of that creative process. The big question for today is, what is the main target of US-led imperialism in the Ukraine? The answer, the target is China, not Russia. China's historic rise as a worker state, no matter what internal problems China may have, is a beacon of hope for the workers and the oppressed around the world, and a huge nightmare for US-led imperialism. We are Marxists. We recognize that economics is the driving force of history. At the end of World War II, the GDP of the USA was 50%, half of the entire world's GDP. US imperialism's economic base at the end of World War II gave it the economic, military, and political control over the capitalist market as it initiated the Cold War to defeat communism. Using these three weapons. One, US imperialism created the World Bank and the IMF with the dollar equated to gold to be the economic base of control of the world capitalist market. Two, US imperialism created military alliances such as NATO to be the military base of control of the world capitalist market. Three, the US imperialism created the United Nations as its political instrument for control of the world capitalist market. The world capitalist market even then dominated the USSR and Eastern Europe back then, and continues to dominate the current worker states, including China. There can be no escape from the capitalist market, be it in New York City or Beijing or Havana. However, China's economic rise is challenging US imperialism's control of that capitalist market, that world capitalist market. Why? Because today China's industrial base is more than double the industrial base of the USA. Let that fact sink in. US-led imperialism has offshored a good portion of its industrial base in its relentless seeking of greater profits. A good portion of that is in China. As a result, US imperialism has created the very rope in China with which to hang themselves. Only recently has it dawned on the vampires running the capitalist system that China's rise is an immediate threat to the very existence of US-led imperialism. The immediate purpose of the US-NATO proxy war in the Ukraine was a failed attempt to isolate China by splitting Russia from China, but it did the very opposite. The war brought Russia and China closer together. The war has also proved to the colonial world that the imperialism is crumbling. The global South, victims of US-led oppression, are now beating a path to Beijing and to Moscow, seeking liberation from the US imperialist vampire. The current sanctions placed on Russia has speeded up the collapse of US-led imperialism's power. Class struggle inside Europe and inside the United States is beginning to break out. Worker anger, however, will need to be focused on the real enemy. That is our job, comrades. As a result of their defeat in the Ukraine, US-led imperialism now faces two choices. One, accept. Okay, got that? Okay. One, accept a surrender of world leadership to the Chinese worker state, or two, start World War III now. 5 years from now will be too late. China's economic rate of growth will eliminate any possibility of a military victory for US-led imperialism if the war is long delayed. There is no middle choice between those two choices. It is war or surrender. Which of the above choices US-led imperialism takes, we can only guess at. According to Larry Johnson, a retired US military official, there is a US naval officer in charge of the Pacific Fleet determined to create a provocation in order to start World War III. Question, doesn't the Pentagon control that US naval officer? Yes, but all capitalist ruling classes are a coalition of competing capitalist groups. The US president and the US government is just the executive board of these competing parasitic interests. Too many comrades have a simplistic view of the ruling class, as if that class is united. It isn't. It is only united against us. Within these parasites, there is no consensus over starting World War III. However, some sections of the capitalist rulers have more influence over the military than others. A big section of the ruling class, even if it is a minority, wants war now and has great influence within the military leadership. These US military commanders are no different than the military leaders who do coups d'etats in other countries. Do you really think that Donald Trump and the Republican Party would oppose a coup? They already tried one on January 6, 2020. The US Navy, as with the UK imperialist Navy of a century ago, is the most right-wing, the most aggressive, the most arrogant, and the most elitist, and the most warmongering part of the US imperialist military. The UK and US naval armadas are the definition of gunboat diplomacy. The war in the Ukraine has demonstrated that in a land war, the US NATO alliance would lose to Russia, let alone China. The US Navy is the only portion of the US military that is more powerful than the Navy of Russia and China. All the capitalist vampires' hopes are with the US naval armada as their possible savior. We must not underestimate the danger to the world that we face today. That is why the communist movement must begin the process of unification in creating militant public demonstrations in support of Russia and China. There is no other option for the workers and the oppressed of the world. Either we win or the capitalist vampires win. The fate of humanity is in our hands, apparently. We need a world network to coordinate our response. So join us. And my question, which side are you on? With communist unity, we can and will win. Power to the people. That's it.
Thank you very much, Comrade Mike Imbull. All right, so we've got about 6 speakers to go. We've got 3 speakers from South America coming up. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker from the Communist League, Liga Comunista, from a section of the LCFI, Brazil. Thank you.
Boa noite, camaradas. Saudações socialistas.
I'm going to make the translation from Fred. He said, good evening, comrades from the... pode repetir, Fred, qual é o nome da organização?
Isso, meu nome é Frederico Costa, estou aqui representando a Liga Comunista do Brasil.
His name is Frederico Costa, he's representing the Communist League from Brazil.
Começo dando uma boa notícia, que neste momento ocorre uma reunião da Liga Comunista do Brasil com o Partido Comunista do Povo Brasileiro.
I started with great news that now they are meeting in Brazil, they have a meeting with the Communist Party of the Brazilian people.
Com o objetivo de uma futura possível fusão em torno de questões como a defesa da Rússia contra os avanços do imperialismo.
With the main objective, one of the main objectives is to make a fusion with the intention to defend Russia from the attacks from the imperialism.
Daí a importância, no nosso ponto de vista, da discussão sobre a necessidade do Partido Mundial da Revolução nesse momento.
That's why the importance of the discussion of the constitution of the Revolutionary World Party in this moment.
Precisamos construir um partido internacional de defesa dos povos oprimidos contra o imperialismo.
We need to build an international party in defense of the oppressed people.
E de defesa do conjunto dos trabalhadores contra a crise inflacionária manipulada pelos capitalistas de todo o mundo.
And in defense of the oppressed people of the inflationary crisis all over the world against the working class.
Todas as principais guerras dos últimos 2 séculos desataram ondas revolucionárias a partir da quebra do equilíbrio capitalista na relação entre os estados.
Every single war after the second war, just a moment, pode repetir, Fred, por favor?
Todas as principais guerras dos últimos 2 séculos desataram ondas revolucionárias.
Every single war of the last 2 centuries has resulted in the revolutionary crisis.
A partir da quebra do equilíbrio capitalista na relação entre os estados.
From the capitalist crisis in the relation of the states.
A Guerra Franco-Prussiana provocou a Comuna de Paris.
The Franco-Prussian War has provoked the Paris 1878 Comuna de Paris.
A Primeira Guerra Mundial provocou a Revolução Bolchevique e a criação da União Soviética.
The First World War has provoked the socialist revolution and the creation of the Soviet Union.
A Segunda Guerra Mundial provocou a onda revolucionária que expropriou o capital em 1/3 do planeta.
The Second World War has provoked a crisis in a world crisis that succeeded and would you repeat? Pode repetir, por favor, Fred, no final sobre
a
crise provocou o quê?
Provocou a expropriação do capital em 1/3 do planeta.
The expropriation of the capital in 1/3 of the planet.
Em 1945, se restaurou o equilíbrio capitalista.
In 1945, it restored the capitalist equilibrium
sob a hegemonia dos Estados Unidos.
Under the hegemony of the United States.
Como uma necessidade de cooperação antagônica contra a União Soviética.
As a necessity of the antagonic cooperation against Soviet Union.
Contra os novos estados operários e o nacionalismo burguês dos países semicoloniais.
Against the new worker states and the nationalism, bourgeois nationalism in the new countries.
Em 1975, com a caída de Saigon,
in 1975, with the fall of Saigon,
e a retirada dos Estados Unidos do Vietnã,
and removed of the United States from Vietnam, withdraw.
Se encerra ciclo de redução territorial do capitalismo.
It has finished a cycle of the reduction of the extension of the imperialism.
Como testemunharam as situações revolucionárias.
As witnessed the revolutionary situations.
Do Irã, Nicarágua, Burkina Faso.
Irã, Nicarágua, Burkina Faso.
Cujos processos revolucionários
in which the revolutionary processes
não deram origem a novos estados operários.
Did not originated new workers states.
Nos últimos 50 anos, a financiarização imperialista.
In the last 50 years, the imperialist financialization
reestabilizou o equilíbrio entre os estados sob a hegemonia dos Estados Unidos.
Re-established the hegemony of the states with the hegemony of the United States. Reestablished the hegemony of imperialism with the hegemony of the United States.
Que se reforçou após a queda da União Soviética em 1991.
That have reinforced with the fall of the Soviet Union.
Com a contra-revolução social nos Estados Operários, entre 1989 e 1991,
with the counter-revolution in the worker states in 89 and 91,
a tendência à redução territorial capitalista foi revertida.
The tendency of would you repeat? Pode repetir, Fred? A tendência?
A tendência à redução territorial capitalista foi revertida.
The tendency of the reduction of the influence of the imperialism was reverted.
Ficando os Estados Unidos como única potência global.
And the rest for the United States as being the unique hegemonic, global hegemonic imperialist.
A situação de equilíbrio imperialista-capitalista nunca foi tão forte como nesse período.
The situation of equilibrium, of balances, imperialista has never been as before.
Sobretudo na década de 1990.
Mainly after the 90s.
Em 2008, com a crise econômica mundial,
in 2008, with economical crisis, world economical crisis,
tem início uma nova fase de desequilíbrio imperialista.
Has begun a new phase of disequilibrium, non-equilibrium imperialist.
Que, no primeiro momento, foi contido artificialmente por uma onda de golpes de Estado, promovida pela CIA.
At first, it was contained for a wage of how I say, revolutions. No, when people protest in great quantity in many states.
Esse desequilíbrio do sistema imperialista,
this non-equilibrium of capitalist system,
se combinou com a aparição de novas potências econômicas e militares.
Has been combined with the appearance of a new economic and military powers.
De tipo neomercantilistas.
Of the type neo-mercantilist.
Yes. Constituídos a partir da herança dos estados operários mais extensos e povoados do passado.
Okay. It was constituted with the remains of the worker state, the former worker state.
É nessa fase que se processa a atual guerra na Ucrânia e se abre a perspectiva de uma terceira guerra mundial.
In this phase, in this context, that is happening the Ukrainian war and the possibility of the Third World War.
Os revolucionários, ok. Os revolucionários devem preparar-se para a tendência de uma nova guerra.
Revolutionaries must be prepared for the possibility of a new war.
Que de fato já começou.
In fact, it has begun.
Precisamos tomar partido pelas nações oprimidas e atacadas pelo imperialismo.
we need to be in defense of the oppressed nations and to take part in defense of them.
E pela defesa incondicional dos estados operários ainda existentes, como Cuba e Coreia do Norte.
And unconditional defense of the worker states, for example, Cuba and North Korea.
Isso se traduz politicamente em apoiar a guerra defensiva da Rússia no leste europeu.
This means objectively in being in defense of Russia and in the European West, European East.
E rechaçar as provocações imperialistas contra a China.
And refuse extremely the provocations against China and Russia.
Não somos pacifistas diante dos blocos beligerantes.
We are not pacifists in face of the belligerent blocs.
É possível que a situação atual evolua.
It is possible that the current situation develops,
amadureça para a Terceira Guerra Mundial nos tempos correntes.
And get entered to get mature to a world war in the next times.
Como demonstrou a provocação de Nancy Pelosi contra a China.
As has showed the provocation of Nancy Pelosi in concern about China, related to China.
As contradições internas do imperialismo estadunidense,
the internal contradictions of the United States imperialism,
ameaçado por uma guerra civil,
threatened by a civil war,
podem acelerar os tempos.
May accelerate the time
da tendência histórica à Terceira Guerra Mundial.
Of the historical tendency of the Third World War.
Porém, não somos impressionistas.
But we are not impressionists.
Como os pousadistas, que caíram em uma visão imediatista da guerra.
Like the posadists that have been taken in immediatist position in the face of the war.
Que renunciaram à construção do internacionalismo proletário.
That gave up the constitution, the build of the Revolutionary Party.
Em favor do nacionalismo burguês e do stalinismo.
In favor of the national bourgeois nationalism and repita a última frase, Fred, nacionalismo burguês e
stalinismo. E do stalinismo.
Okay. And Stalinism.
Sabemos que só uma irrupção revolucionária do proletariado pode evitar uma nova guerra mundial.
We know that only the eruption of revolutionary movements can change this situation.
Todavia, se essa guerra não for evitada,
otherwise, if this war cannot be avoided,
devemos estar preparados para aproveitar a queda do equilíbrio capitalista.
We must be prepared to take chance of the disequilibrium of the capitalist system. Take the opportunities back.
Para avançarmos além do bloco capitalista neomercantilista.
To advance much more beyond the capitalist system.
Que hoje é impulsionado para a criação de uma frente única anti-imperialista.
That has been pushed in the creation of a unique front of anti-capitalist unique front
de estados burgueses oprimidos e estados operários,
of the state, oppressed bourgeois states and worker states.
Consideramos que o proletariado mundial e os povos oprimidos de todo o mundo
We consider that pode repetir, Fred?
Consideramos que o proletariado mundial e os povos oprimidos de todo o mundo
We consider that the world proletariat and the oppressed people all over the world
devem aproveitar as fissuras interburguesas
must take the opportunity inside the division of the bourgeoisie forces
para impor seu próprio programa
to impose our own program
e mudar a realidade.
and change the reality.
Se conseguirmos compreender melhor essa realidade,
If we succeed to understand better this reality,
estabelecer as tarefas necessárias,
establish necessary tasks
diante das exigências da luta de classes,
in face of the demands of the class struggle,
contra a OTAN e contra a inflação,
against NATO and against inflation,
contra o imperialismo e contra o capitalismo,
against imperialism and capitalism,
poderemos superar o atual estágio de um embrião de sociedade internacional de propaganda.
we may overcome the state of embryo and superar o embrião e o quê?
Superar um embrião de sociedade internacional de propaganda.
To overcome the embryo of international of propaganda.
Em fase de reagrupamento
In phase of regroupment
e estabelecimento de um programa
and establishing a program
para construirmos o Partido Mundial da Revolução Socialista.
for build the World Party of Revolutionary Socialists.
Que o atual estágio da luta de classes exige.
That the current situation demands from us.
Grande abraço aos camaradas. Viva a Revolução Mundial.
Big hugs to comrades. Long life to world revolutionary socialism.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to the comrades of the Communist League, LCFI, and Brazil. We'll move on now to the Communist Party of the Brazilian people. And thanks to Ida for your efforts translating there. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Saudações a todos os participantes.
Greetings for all participants.
Sou o secretário-geral do Partido Comunista do Povo Brasileiro.
I am General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Brazilian people.
E nossa fala será concisa.
Our speech will be very short.
Em virtude de estarmos participando de uma conferência com a Liga dos Comunistas.
Because we are participating this moment in a meeting with the Liga Comunista.
Visando a fusão das duas organizações.
With the intention, the fusion of the two organizations.
E uma das pautas da nossa conferência é a conjuntura internacional.
One of the issues of our conference is the international geopolitical discussion.
Onde discutimos com muita profundidade o que ocorre na Ucrânia e a ação da OTAN visando cercar e aniquilar a Rússia.
With the main issues is the discussion of the Ukraine and how to reinforce the support of against imperialism.
Na nossa opinião,
in our opinion,
urge a desnazificação da Ucrânia.
It is very important the denazification of Ukraine.
E a necessária expulsão dos mercenários que estão a serviço da OTAN na luta contra a Rússia.
And the necessity of expelling the neo-Nazi fascist groups inside Ukraine.
A paz só será atingida.
Would you repeat? Pode repetir, por favor?
A paz só será atingida.
Okay. Peace will only be achieved
quando a Ucrânia for derrotada política e militarmente.
When Ukraine will be defeated politically and militarily.
Porque a derrota da Ucrânia é a derrota da OTAN.
Because the defeat of Ukraine is the defeat of NATO.
Saudações a todos. Essa é a nossa contribuição. Muito obrigado.
Big hug, salutation for everyone. This is our contribution.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, comrades from the Communist Party of the Brazilian people, and congratulations to yourself and the Communist League on your productive talks with each other. Our last speaker from South America is from the militant Bolshevik tendency, from the LCFI, and then straight after that we'll have our two speakers from Asia. So I'd like to introduce the militant Bolshevik tendency, LCFI, from Argentina. Thank you.
Okay. People, I have to go. Sorry for my bad English. No, TNP.
Buenas noches, compañeros. Soy de la tendencia militante bolchevique de Argentina. Si bien...
German, do you need... ¿Usted precisa de mí para la traducción de español para inglés?
Está bien. Sí, preciso la traducción.
Okay, I'm going to try, comrades, to translate from Spanish to English. I have a good understanding of Spanish, but I will try to do my best, okay? Con espacio, German, con espacio.
Está bien. Buenas noches, camaradas.
Good evening, comrades.
Soy representante de la tendencia militante bolchevique de Argentina.
I'm representing the tendencia bolchevique from Argentina.
Si bien soy de Argentina, en este momento me encuentro en Brasil.
Although I am from Argentina, in this moment I am in Brazil.
Estoy invitado a la conferencia entre la Liga Comunista y el PCPB.
I've been invited inside the conference with the Liga Comunista and the PC, el Partido Comunista del Brazilian People.
Bueno, comenzaré a exponer.
I will begin with...
La guerra en Ucrania ya completó 200 días.
The war in Ukraine has been completed 200 days.
La guerra en Ucrania expresa la vuelta de grandes guerras de enfrentamiento indirecto.
The Ukraine war is representing the beginning of new conflicts and wars.
Enfrentamiento entre las grandes potencias militares en Guerra Fría.
The enfrentamiento Okay, the start of fighting with the great powers in the Cold War, in the new Cold War.
También la guerra en Ucrania representa la decadencia creciente del imperialismo estadounidense.
Also, the Ukraine war represents the growing growing less influence from the United States imperialism.
Esto da origen a una ola planetaria de protestas populares.
This gives us originated the protests all around the world of the working class.
Protestas contra la inflación desatada por la repercusión de las sanciones de Occidente sobre Rusia.
Protests against inflation caused by the sanctions imposed by the United States and Western imperialism against Russia.
Más sobre todo, una inflación alimentada por la búsqueda incesante del capital.
And the huge inflation for the search of profits of the capital.
Que utiliza la guerra como pretexto.
Que uses the war with the pretext.
Para ampliar la tasa de exploración sobre el trabajo.
The pretext to make bigger the exploitation against the working class.
Valorizando las mercaderías y desvalorizando los salarios.
Evaluating the goods to put below the wages.
En algunos países, la lucha contra la extorsión inflacionaria.
In some countries, the fight against the inflation.
O sea, la lucha económica de resistencia popular contra los capitalistas.
The fight of the working class, economical fight of the working class against the capitalists.
Se combina objetiva y ya subjetivamente.
Has combined subjective and objectively
con la lucha antiimperialista e internacionalista contra la OTAN.
Has combined it with the fight, anti-imperialist fight against NATO.
Durante la guerra actual nace otro conflicto de proporción mundial.
In this current war has born a new. Pode repetir, German, a última frase?
Durante la guerra actual nace otro conflicto de proporciones mundiales y proletarias.
Okay. In this current war has born a conflict of the proletariat conscience.
Más amplio y creciente.
Bigger and growing.
La primavera de la población de varias naciones de la Tierra.
The summer. Okay, I forgot the word. The forestations. Summer, after summer.
Primavera.
Primavera, la primavera. Pode repetir, German? La primavera de...
La primavera de la población de varias naciones de la Tierra.
La primavera of the populations of the very country of the world.
Contra la inflación.
Against the inflation.
Original las sanciones impuestas a Rusia y sus aliados.
Linked to sanctions of Russia and his allies.
impuestas por el imperialismo occidental,
imposed by the Western imperialism,
que de inmediato hace subir el precio del gas, petróleo y alimentos,
that immediately has make grow the price of the energy
en todo el globo,
in all the world, energy and the food in all the world.
26 países tienen por lo menos 50% de sus exportaciones de trigo provenientes de Ucrania y de Rusia.
At least 26 countries has the food from Ukraine and Russia.
Más como demuestra el relatorio creciente presentado por la ONU,
As has showed the report by United Union,
actual crisis de escasez global de alimentos,
current crisis of food,
nace en 2015.
It has begun in 2015.
Siendo por tanto anterior a la guerra y la pandemia.
In this way, is before the current war.
Y provocada por la acumulación y especulación financiera.
Provoked by the accumulation and speculation, financial speculation.
Practicada por el capital en el ramo de la alimentación.
And make it by the capital with his economy system.
Las ganancias están en el orden de $1 billón cada 2 días.
The profit it's about $2 billion each day.
En 2021 la multinacional Cargill obtiene casi $4 billones en lucro líquido.
German, 4 billions.
Sí, 4 billones, 4.000 millones, 4 billones en portugués.
In 2021, Cargill has profited $4 billion.
Su mayor superávit en 156 años de historia.
His major superávit in more than 150 years.
El actual ciclo extraordinario de acumulación de capitales
The current extraordinary accumulation of capital
se apoya en un también extraordinario crecimiento da fome mundial.
It has his seeds in the growing and deeply when you are hungry of the people. Starving of the people. Excuse me, starving of the people.
Oh, gracias por lo que estás haciendo, John. Contra esa inflación en varias partes del mundo,
against this inflation in many parts of the world,
protestas de masa sacuden regímenes.
Mass protests has shocked the regimes in the world.
Que transfieren para sus povos os costos inflacionarios das sanciones do imperialismo.
These governments transfer to the people, the working class, the cost of these sanctions and this war.
Alemania, Bangladesh, Francia,
Germany, France,
Bangladesh,
Indonesia,
Inglaterra, Italia, Moldavia,
England, Italy, Moldavia,
República Checa, Serbia.
República Checa, Serbia.
En muchos países ecloden manifestaciones espontáneas contra inflación.
In many countries, exploded spontaneous manifestation and protestation against inflation.
Muitos deles contra a OTAN.
Much of them against NATO.
Cabe a nos
It's for us, our task,
el avanzar en un reagrupamiento
it's to advance on regroupment,
una nueva internacional,
a new international,
para conducir esas lutas
to leading these struggles, those fights,
y las futuras contra el FOME y la inflación.
and the future struggles against inflation.
En una orientación decidida contra el imperialismo y por la construcción del socialismo.
In a decisive constitution against imperialism for socialism.
Eso es todo, camaradas. Buenas noches. Y muchas gracias, Joao.
This is all, comrades. Big hugs.
Thank you very much to the comrades of the militant Bolshevik tendency, and thank you very much to Ida for making all that accessible to the English speakers. Thank you, really appreciate it. Thank you. All right.
Okay, thank you very much for all.
And we'll move on to our last two speakers from Asia. So our next speaker is the Bolshevik group, South Korea.
Hello, comrades. Before I start, I have a thing to inform you. I'd like to comment on BT Bolshevik tendency before our presentation. Regarding the BT's speech today, we welcome their point that the slogan, "Stop the NATO war against Russia and China," is pacifist and opportunistic. That was our argument in early August. But BT has continued to fail to explain their contradiction between their positions in 2014 and 2022 in Ukraine, between neutrality and accusing neutrality as opportunism. We, Bolshevik group, participated the last open letter for May Day, but do not participate in this call out for action on September. We explained the reason in the internal discussion of Marxist Speak Out, especially because of the second paragraph. There are a groundless and exaggerated view that sections of the US ruling class are also banking on the insane idea that in the event of full-scale war with Russia and China, the US can win a nuclear war. And an imaginary hope expressed in the sentence, "Stop these imperialist vampires destroying the planet," with an international outcry. In the background lies their own panic about war. The May joint statement had the spirit of the working class fighting against US-led NATO imperialism. But this joint statement contains a panic that war should be prevented at all costs. We assume that the phrase "world on fire" in the banner of joint action and the image of the earth burning under the flames of nuclear war are such expressions of fear that throughout the class consciousness. In the meantime, the main strike point has changed from US-led NATO imperialism in May to the war itself that must be protected even by outcry in September. The target of the spearhead shifted from the devil itself to the shadow of devil. The dramatic escalation of the Sino-US conflict served as the trigger for the war panic. On August 3rd, US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, which created a sense of crisis between China and the US, that a war would erupt at any moment. It growled as if anyone would open fire first, and the imperialist media amplified its appearance. Then the fear of war, which has been trapped in the Eastern Europe fringe, was released and spread out to North America and Western Europe, which have been safe zones. The panic that nuclear war must be prevented, whatever it costs, has been released. The paraphrase, there was a madness trying to open the door by pushing through. Pushing, though it can only be opened when the handle was turned. The joint action quaked by the panic. The cause of the war is imperialism, which is the highest stage of the capitalism. The violence of imperialism is not accidental. It's a law of itself. It is the nature of capitalism and imperialism to survive only when profits are maximized. Thus, the violence of imperialism is not as incomprehensible madness as that of serial killers. Judging their violence as something crazy is not based on the nature of the object itself. It was the panic of observer that made it look that way. And the panic leads to the wrong path of bourgeois pacifism. At the end of the road is the advocacy of their country's imperialism. The nature of imperialist war is to make the working people of all parts of the world obedient subject to exploitation. That is the reason for the war. The main goal of US-led imperialism is to subdue a semi-colonial state Russia, which was repeatedly resisted imperialist hegemony, and a deformed worker state China, which is still based on vast state ownership, and to devour the huge industries and resources of the two nations. That is the only way for capitalism and imperialism to escape and rejuvenate from ruin. This is the essence of Ukrainian war and Sino-American conflict. Capitalism, which was on the brink of destruction during World War I and II, was able to revive with the cooperation of the imperialist minions within the working class. The task of Marxists in imperialist countries is not to discourage the ruling class from walking towards the war. We can't stop war by the outcry. Imperialists have always responded to the outcry, which is gripped by the war fear. We are also opposed to war. There will be no war soon. The Marxist mission is to firmly promote that the cause of the war is imperialism, that peace is impossible under the capitalism and imperialism, and that a socialist revolution that defeats imperialism at home and overthrows capitalism is the only way to end the war. This was the spirit of Zimmerwald left that built the leadership of the Russian Revolution. Now that the right chauvinist madness is escalating, this work could be a lonely road. However, as seen in the past history, the situation changes rapidly in certain period. From 1916 to 17 is an example of such a dramatic change. We are seeing such signs all over the world. The hegemony of imperialism is weakening, and incidents are accumulating one after another to raise the morale of workers in each country fighting against it. The 2014 Euromaidan coup was the latest success of imperialist regime change. Meanwhile, similar attempts have since been thwarted in Syria, Venezuela, Bolivia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The United States failed to make a nosebleed of North Korea or Iran, which openly resisted imperialist hegemony, and they were awfully ousted after losing the war in Afghanistan. There was also a rare scene in which angry working class entered the Sri Lankan presidential palace without bleeding, where the imperialist servant stayed. Saudi Arabia and India The traditional allies of the United States are also openly reported to ignore US demands and make friendly faces to Russia and China. Strategic resources such as oil and gas are traded not only in dollar, but also in ruble and yuan. These things that have happened in the last 10 years are rarely seen in the last 100 years. The world working class is carefully watching this strange scene and getting inspiration for liberation. This scene is not only seen by oppressed people. There are also pro-imperialist servants in many countries that are difficult to sustain for months without imperialist military support. They are terrified that they may easily be abandoned by their imperialist masters. Thus, this era is a general current of advantage for the global working class on the one hand, and general disadvantages for imperialism on the other hand. So, for the peace, the desperate wish of the working people, defeat imperialism, overthrow the first link of the imperialist slave chain, social democracy, social patriotism, bourgeois pacifism, and Anglo-American chauvinism. Build a revolutionary international party that will break the chains of slavery. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much to the comrades of the Bolshevik group South Korea for that presentation, which is lots for all of us to think about. Our last speaker, so I'd like to thank them for their patience, is from Timor-Leste, East Timor. It's from, I hope I get the pronunciation right, Comate Esperanza. Please correct my pronunciation, but I'd like to welcome the comrade from East Timor. Thank you.
Thanks, Comrade Devi. Yeah, you're totally correct with the spelling. Camaradas y compañeros, comrades all over the world. This conference has led us to the strategic historical experience and memories of the spirit of revolutionary socialists of Zimmerwald. It is second honor to us to share this historical moment with you and stand all along with you in facing our dangerous and cynical moments. And here we have a representative of East Timor Social Life Movement. Along with the Comité Esperanza from East Timor are Clube Estudante Progressivo, Movimento Resistência Social, Juventude Socialista Movere, Movimento Rosas Mel, Reabilitação Ecologia Nacional, Ermera Peasants Union, and Manifahi Peasants Union, and so on in here. Again, it is our privilege to speak on this historical day. 11 September marked the 200 days of US-NATO war against Russia and its preparation for war against China. On the other, today also marked a decade of 9/11 or September attacks, a terrorist attack that means to us oppositely. That is for us the attack that resulted by the disease of the fundamentalism that was created by the virus of the Western liberalisms and imperialism. We are living in a time of historical chaos that follows in parallel with the obscurantist reaction and restoration. Before I move into the current Ukraine war, I would like to talk and discuss the central neglected questions on the historical development of our time. That is impasse. That is the name that's responsible or the reflection of the structural crisis of the international communities for its absence in the current crisis and war. A question that has been raised by our friends and comrade Mike Gimbel in here. For us, our problem for decades is not only a crisis, but also an impasse. It was a situation characterized our tipsy world today, and in which many march forwardness always lead to march backwardness, and of course, to now here move, something like that. Impasse is a determinal point of our historical time. We found impasse is not a simple name or political grammatical expression, something like that. It is not simply equivalent to economist words such as stagnation. It is not only a transition or regression or finalism of particular conjuncture or epiphenomenon of crisis, not an extensive monstrosity, not either the negation of any shift in the representation, but the existential normality in between the absence of emancipatory politics and globalized imperialist capitalism as such. Therefore, the contemporary conjuncture of global capitalism shows the overexpanding crisis produced under the impossible crisis of the system as a whole to the entire capitalist modernity. The crisis persists in its long downturn and decline because it is maintained throughout the prolonged crisis of impasse. It's not all the current regression and absence of emancipatory politics, prolonged downturn and the stagnation of global capitalism reflecting the deepening expansion of both entangled crisis and impasse in the normal function of capitalism as impassable system and crisis-prone contradictory system. We today witnessing the merging of two structural fields that permit a deep impasse of a crisis and a crisis of impasse, two of the situations that we face right now. The current situation implies the need to move beyond the dominant, unequivocal understanding of disorder of our system. The impasse now became the dominant axiomatic name of the contemporary conjuncture, perhaps an uncanny real that we must accept and to move beyond. The combined distinction with crisis conditioned the united between both reconstituted toward new substance of the system and the current representation. According to necessity of understanding this combined disorder and obscure substance that force us to rethink and rediscover the contemporary conjuncture in order to foment a new social imagination and experimentation of collective politics and dialectical coordination between the North and South, to retain the struggle and capacity to mobilize the balance of force on the national level that will lead us to transcend the global neoliberal financial capitalism and to move forward a long transition to a war socialism. Now let's go back to the war in Ukraine, the proxy war against Russia in Ukraine as a battlefield. For us, the war in Ukraine has a dual character in here. The first one is a national fascist counter-revolutionary, and the other one is imperialist war for profit against Russia and then to China. It is a fascist war that is reactive against the crisis, against the people, against the left, against Russia, and the preservation of the decadent system. While in another, it is an imperialist war of conquest of wealth and for the sake of accumulation, of profit, and of course, to empire building. Ukraine neoliberal fascism is the rightful enemy of the people, or the working masses, either in Ukraine, in Russia, in Europe, in US, in global South, on the national left, and so on. War and fascism in Ukraine are not simply the extension or the means of the bourgeoisie or monopoly capital violence against the working masses. Both are the essence of the expression of decay and disintegrated capitalisms, and the deep contradiction unfolding in our global imperialist capitalism. And for us, the fascism is a reactionary force directive toward a decadent system and disintegrated society. Its political and ideological function were to restore and protect the regime of profit, to safeguard the private property regime amidst the growing decadence and crisis. So here it leads to an important and provocative question over the national question of Ukraine in our current situation in war, which is our sectarian and our Puritan Western left, something like that, has committed to support this, to support the NATO narrative, to support the imperialist chessboard in here. First is that, are the Ukraine government or state are neutral in this situation? For us, there's a big no in here. And for us as a left, as a communist, and for the European left and the Northern left, something like that, our rule, our task is to expose the bourgeoisie, the dependent, the parasitic, the predatory character of the Ukrainian government and its fascistic elements, something like that. The Ukrainian national has completely filled the three triangulation character of 21st century fascism. It has a neoliberal reactionary power in the state, it has a fascist force in the civil society, and it has the fascist monopoly behind of it. So the second question is that, did the US and NATO fight for the Ukrainian freedom or independence? There's a big no again for this. Here again, the US and NATO fight for the liberation of the Russian wealth and resources to be able to privatize as what the Ukrainian government has done to IMF, to World Bank, to US imperialist riot, something like that. It ensured the natural and human resources to be able to be controlled by the North. It was a war that replaced the Ukrainian blood with a profit to the imperialist triad. Therefore, this fascist and imperialist counter-revolutionary war is a war that perpetrated a subjective and objective violence to the people of Ukraine, to entire global people. And the NATO, therefore, it was an imperialist war of geopolitical expansion to weakening and designed for regime change across the counter-hegemonic countries of Russia and China and movement of the East and South. This is a war to rebuild US global hegemony and nuclear supremacy. It's just another war preparation to counter a revolutionary war against China industrial market socialism, which is this a decade exceptional achievement resulted from the Chinese state and party political system known as democratic centralism. This war and militarism financed by us in the South, by the working masses in advanced capitalist nation, by the crucifixion of the vast mass of the global population. Before I jump to the end, I would like to propose some optimistic of the wheel here. So what is the progressive and non-progressive character of war in Ukraine? The non-progressive part of the war is that it aims, this is the non-progressive part. This aims at accumulation at war scale. This is how the militarism abroad was central to imperial global strategy of accumulation and hegemony, and a war as a means of preserving the stability of the system and hegemony. That is a unipolar super imperialism of US-led globalized neoliberal imperialist order. Consequently, it brings more suffering to the working people in global South countries. That is mean it is more pillaging, more austerity, more deep, and more transfer of wealth from South to North. The progressive part of the crisis and war initiated by the fascist imperialist aggression for our particular task in the 20th century is that this disease not only struck us, it is not only simply bring more deaths and suffering, but it helps dissolve the capitalist schizophrenia, inducing social confusion and impasse. It is with this that the idea and the tendency of the permanent Holocaust is not just simply a dystopia of the end of history where rational talk has claimed to have framed the society of late capitalism, but some has referred to super calamity where the aggressive social inequality, misery, and pauperization, coupled with the worldwide ecological crisis, social inequality, pandemic, and potential nuclear war has approaching us in the so-called a period of return to normativity, as our beloved liberal and Democrats and right-winger has promised the masses. The imperialist proxy war in Ukraine, the US-NATO war in Russia and China over Ukraine, and now Taiwan is traditional form of unjust war. The unjust war is non-progressive war. What is unjust war shall be responded with a just war by peace-loving countries. I think that's what Russia is doing and what China has to do. While in addition, fascist war backed by the imperialist North is a war to maintain what described as war to protect the evolution by within and continuity. An irrational move and action to safeguard the continuity of the impasse of decadent, of moribund, of barbarism of our system. As Marxists and as communists in movements, our solidarity should be with all independent liberation movement and oppressed nation, and it should be equal to existing peace-loving countries that are facing the imperialist aggression and war for profits. To end, Marxism is a proletarian science. It is a science of the partisan, to take side, to look, to work, and struggle from the side of the unseen, of the oppressed and exploited class of people. So though the question of war, a war always provoked and initiated by the ruling established power, by the monopoly, by the capitalist state of the North. The objective reality since the rise of the era of capitalism is maintained along this objective law. The imperialist war is an unjust war that should be totally opposed by the people and any socio-political life. The Russian position is clear. It is to defend the Russian sovereignty and its people, to defend the oppressed people in Ukraine, of defensive war countering the cruel expansionist war for profit and fascist war of preserving the stability of the profit regime. Again, the current organic crisis in capitalism with the resurgence of right and authoritarian and populist reaction in power in many parts of the world, especially the North, again, will test the historical hypothesis to the return of popular revolt in many parts of the global South against the tyrannical return of the neo-fascists across the civil society, the reactionary far right in political power of the state, and the hegemony of monopoly capital with its transnational, corporate, and financialized variant. Again, the First and the Second World War has gave us the revolution and war across the world during the 20th century. And we are not afraid with the possible and consequence of war that will open a new horizon for national and international socialist revolution. That is why Mao Zedong said, first, we are against it. Second, we are not afraid of it. Comrades, we don't want war. It is an imperialist war that imposed to us, that forced the people to take arms and to fight. Down with war, down with imperialisms. La lucha continúa. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our comrades from East Timor and Fernando from Comite Esperanto. Okay, that was our final speaker. I think if it's okay, I'm going to wrap it up here because we've been going for more than 3 hours. So just to sum it all up, thanks to all our speakers from, as I said at the start, from 5 different continents and from 10 different countries who have come together in the spirit of international Marxism today. This is up on the call out for actions against imperialist war Facebook page already. We'll put it up on YouTube, send a link around from the World on Fire YouTube page. It's clear from all these speeches today, we are united in our hostility to imperialist war and in the struggle for socialism and the need to organize internationally. There are some areas of difference and healthy debate. Let's keep the discussion going as much as we can between forums, that we don't need to wait until a panel to talk to each other. There's some really important discussions to be had. I would like to echo Melinda from the Socialist Unity Party's statement, where she emphasized that I think our panels, through our panels and statements, are having some impact on the debate amongst Marxists, and I think it was very important that we got together today and continued that process. And we're all looking forward, excited, as Fernando said, we're not afraid. So we're excited to see where this process will take us in the days and months ahead. I've reworked the slogans I was going to finish the meeting with to try and make them something we can all agree on. So hopefully you'll agree we can all join together under these slogans and these demands. Victory to the working class over imperialism, victory to the working class over fascism, down with capitalism, and victory to socialism. Thank you very much, comrades, for all coming together today. And
thank you.
Thank you very much, and we will do this again.
Thank you so much. Saudações revolucionárias to all.
Saudações revolucionárias, camaradas.
Saudações revolucionárias, camaradas.
See you on the barricades.
Yes. We will win.
Saudações revolucionárias from Timor-Leste.
We have a friends in Timor-Leste here.
Yes.
Yeah. There is a various group who are joining us in the same room.
Right.
It's wonderful to see the comrades there.
All power to Timor-Leste.
All power to the people of the world.
Yes. Humanity, it's a race.
All right. Well, I might stop the recording there, unless anyone's got any last declarations.
All the best.